Welcome back. Get comfortable, dim the lights if you haven't already. Tonight we are going deep, really deep, into the hidden world of a show that has been part of the American living room since January 31st, 1999. A show that started as a strange, hyperactive fever dream from the imagination of a 24-year-old animation student and somehow became one of the longest-running primetime comedies in the history of television. We are talking about Family Guy, and tonight we are not here for the obvious stuff. We are not here to rehash plots you have seen 100 times, or argue about whether the later seasons are good or bad. We are here for the stuff buried underneath. The stories behind the stories. The decisions that almost never happened. The secrets hidden in backgrounds that most viewers scroll past without registering. The coincidences so strange they feel impossible. And the real human lives that quietly shaped every single character you have ever watched on your screen. So settle in, let the voices wash over you, and let us begin at the very beginning. Not with the episode you have seen, but with the world that created it. Section 1. The world that built the show. Seth MacFarlane, Rhode Island, and the Life of Larry. There is a version of the world where Family Guy does not exist at all, where the whole thing never happened, where the animation student from Kent, Connecticut finishes his thesis film, gets a job drawing cartoons for other people's shows, draws those cartoons quietly for 40 years, and that is the end of the story. And there is an argument, a genuinely unsettling one, that this version of the world almost happened not once, but several times. But we will get to that. Seth Woodbury MacFarlane was born on October 26, 1973, in a small New England town called Kent, in the northwestern corner of Connecticut. The town is quiet in the way that small New England towns are quiet. Not the absence of activity, but the presence of a kind of settled life. A life that has been going on in that particular place for long enough that it no longer feels the need to announce itself. The leaves there turn spectacular shades of orange every fall. The winters are cold enough to produce a specific kind of meanness in people who have lived through too many of them, and the summers are brief and precious enough that every warm day carries a slight grief for the ones that are already behind it. His father was a prep school teacher. His mother worked in the admissions office of a school. He had a sister named Rachel, who would eventually follow him into voice acting and become one of the most recognizable voices in his subsequent animated work. From an early age, Seth MacFarlane had an almost obsessive relationship with cartoons, with old Hollywood musicals, with big band jazz, and with the particular kind of comedy that flourished in American television during the 1970s. He was not watching these things in the passive, half-distracted way that most children watch television. He was absorbing them, taking them apart, filing away the rhythms and cadences of the performers he most admired, building an interior library of comic timing and vocal technique that he would spend the rest of his career drawing from. At 18, he left Connecticut and enrolled at the Rhode Island School of Design in Providence, a city that sits at the northern end of Narragansett Bay and that has always had a slightly melancholy quality to it. The quality of a place that was once important in the history of American industry, and that now holds that history gently, preserving the brick and the cobblestone and the particular, atmospheric weight of what it used to be. The school, which everyone refers to as RISD and pronounces RISD, occupies a set of buildings on College Hill above the Providence River, with views of the State House Dome and the cluster of downtown towers that have defined the city's skyline for decades. MacFarlane studied animation at RYSD. The particular character of Providence, its compact geography, its slightly provincial confidence, its accent that is distinct enough from Boston's to be its own thing, worked its way deeply into his imagination over the 4 years he spent there. He has described Rhode Island in interviews as feeling like a miniature version of Boston. Familiar but slightly off, specific without being precious. The kind of place that has a strong local identity without taking that identity quite so seriously as to become tedious about it. Something about the state's smallness. It is the smallest state in the Union. The entirety of Rhode Island could fit inside some Texas counties. And its strange working class pride and the particular accent of its people struck McFarlane as both funny and deeply human. The accent, which he has specifically mentioned finding inherently hilarious, has a quality unlike any other regional American dialect. It drops its R's in ways that Boston does not quite drop them. It extends certain vowels. It has its own set of expressions and inflections that announce, with every sentence, the specific geography of the person speaking. It was at RISD that McFarlane created the film that started everything. For his senior thesis project, he produced an animated short called The Life of Larry. The premise was simple to the point of being almost nothing. A middle-aged, not particularly bright man named Larry had an unremarkable life, and a talking dog named Steve. If you can find a copy of The Life of Larry online, and recordings do exist and circulate among fans, the resemblance to what Family Guy would eventually become is immediately striking in a way that is almost uncanny. Larry moves and speaks in a way that is recognizably the rough early draft of Peter Griffin. He has the same broad build, the same working-class rhythms in his speech, the same combination of amiability and complete intellectual vacancy. Steve is Brian Griffin at an earlier, sketchier stage of development. The same intelligent dog serving as the grounding voice in a relationship with a fundamentally ungrounded human being. The humor is warm and slightly absurd, with a working-class undercurrent that is more affectionate than condescending. The short is charming and genuinely funny, but it is also clearly the work of a student who has the ideas and the instincts, but has not yet had the resources to fully realize what he is imagining. McFarlane's professor at RISD submitted The Life of Larry to Hanna-Barbera, the legendary animation studio that had been responsible for the Flintstones, Scooby-Doo, Yogi Bear, The Jetsons, Top Cat, and dozens of other shows that define the golden age of American television animation. By the mid-1990s, Hanna-Barbera was operating under Cartoon Network, and they were actively looking for young animation talent who could create content for their expanding lineup. They watched McFarlane's thesis film and immediately offered him a job. He graduated in 1995 and moved to Los Angeles, where he contributed writing and animation to shows including Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. The payment he received for The Life of Larry, for the film that would eventually become the foundation of one of the most commercially successful animated franchises in history, was approximately $9,000. This represents, with the benefit of hindsight, one of the most spectacular cases of a creative work being purchased for a fraction of its eventual value in the history of American entertainment. While working at Hanna-Barbera, McFarlane continued developing his ideas. In 1997, Cartoon Network aired a second animated short he had created. This one called Larry and Steve as part of their What a Cartoon programming block. This was a showcase that had been created specifically to give animators and writers an opportunity to try out ideas that might eventually become full series. The block had already launched or helped to develop several significant shows, and it served as a kind of incubator for animated television talent in the late 1990s. Larry and Steve refined the dynamic between the two characters, making the relationship between the amiable, not very bright human and his articulate, witty dog feel more specific and more interesting. The contrast between Larry's guileless enthusiasm and Steve's dry, weary intelligence was sharper. In the second short, more committed to exploring what made the pairing funny. Something about these two characters kept working, kept suggesting that there was considerably more story available in this particular dynamic than a short film could contain. Around this time, McFarlane had been in contact with executives from a sketch comedy show called MAD-TV, which aired on Fox. The original plan was that he would create animated short segments that could run as inserts during the show's broadcast, a format similar to the one through which The Simpsons had originally found its audience, as brief animated sketches within The Tracy Ullman Show. This plan collapsed for a reason that is very common in the entertainment industry and very rarely romantic: money. Maddie TV did not have the budget to support animation production at the scale that MacFarlane was imagining. The idea was abandoned. But here is where the kind of providence that the city of MacFarlane's education suggests stepped in. The executives at MAD-TV had relationships with people at Fox Broadcasting itself, and they made introductions. MacFarlane went to Fox and pitched his concept for an animated family sitcom set in New England. He was 24 years old. The network gave him $50,000 to produce a pilot presentation, a sum that seems small by the standards of modern television development, but that in 1998 was enough to create something substantial if you were willing to do most of the work yourself. MacFarlane went home and made something that the network had not expected. He drew large portions of the presentation himself. He animated significant sections of it himself. He wrote the entire thing. He recorded all the voice work himself, doing the voices that would eventually become Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, because he had always heard these voices in his head with complete clarity, and it seemed more efficient to simply perform them than to attempt to describe the specific sounds he was imagining to someone else. The presentation was approximately 15 minutes in length and was, by the accounts of everyone who saw it at Fox, a remarkably complete and fully realized piece of work. When the network's development executives watched it, they did not offer MacFarlane a conditional development deal subject to revision and refinement. They greenlit the show for a full first season immediately. Seth MacFarlane became, at the age of 24, the youngest showrunner in the history of American network television. This is worth pausing on. Showrunning is one of the most complex and demanding jobs in all of entertainment. The showrunner is simultaneously the creative vision, the writer, the editor, the supervisor of an entire production organization, the arbiter of every creative dispute, the person who signs off on every script and every animation choice and every music cue and every casting decision. Most people who eventually become showrunners have spent a decade or more in the industry before they take on that level of responsibility. They have served as staff writers, story editors, producers, and executive producers on other people's shows. They have had years to learn the craft, to make mistakes at lower stakes, to absorb the institutional knowledge of how the business works before being put in charge of a significant portion of it. MacFarlane did all of this cold, in his mid-20s, fresh from art school with no prior television experience of the kind that typically prepares a person for the role. There is a detail about the show's early pitch history that tends to get lost in the general narrative, and it is a detail that adds a layer of private satisfaction to the show's existence. The project that MacFarlane pitched to Fox before Family Guy existed was called Gumball 2 Gumball. It was built around Bryant Gumball, the respected television sports anchor and news journalist, and it was rejected by Fox without hesitation. The network passed on it entirely, without apparent regret or significant consideration. MacFarlane was disappointed and moved forward, and Family Guy was his second attempt at the network. Years later, after Family Guy had become a significant part of Fox's identity and one of the network's most recognizable brands, MacFarlane embedded a tribute to his rejected first pitch inside the show. In the episode where Peter becomes obsessed with getting his favorite television show back on the air, that favorite show is a fictional program called Gumball 2 Gumball Beats Justice. The joke works on multiple levels simultaneously. It is funny on its face as a description of an improbable fictional show. It is a private acknowledgement to people who know the backstory. And it is a gentle, permanent middle finger at the network that turned it down the first time around. The show is set in Rhode Island because MacFarlane had spent his most formative adult years there and felt a genuine affection for the state that he had never seen depicted in any significant American comedy. When asked about the choice directly, in a Reddit AMA that he conducted several years ago. He described Rhode Island as feeling fresh in the way that a place can feel fresh when you love it and also understand exactly how funny it is. Like a miniature Boston, he said, with an accent that is inherently funny. His writing partner and co-developer Danny Smith has told the more complicated version of the story of how the fictional town came to exist. Fox wanted the show to have a specific, geographically grounded setting. MacFarlane and Smith knew immediately that the setting should be Rhode Island. But Smith, having previously written a joke about the real city of Pawtucket for a different show, and having subsequently found himself on the receiving end of furious backlash from actual Pawtucket residents, including, memorably, the mayor, who had been genuinely and publicly offended, was determined that this time the setting should be fictional. He had no desire to revisit the experience of being vilified on talk radio in Rhode Island for making a small joke about a city's name. The solution was to invent a town, and the name they chose for the invented town was not made up. A quahog is a large, hard-shelled clam found in abundance along the Atlantic coast of North America, deeply associated with New England cooking and culture. One of the defining ingredients of the clam chowder that is a regional obsession. The word derives from the Narragansett language, from the word Quonochontog, and it has been absorbed into American English through centuries of contact between English-speaking colonists and the indigenous peoples of the region. It has the specific quality of a New England word, slightly strange in the mouth, carrying the weight of a particular geography available only to people who already know the territory. Naming the fictional town after a clam is itself a joke, and it is the right kind of joke for a show set in a place that takes its local identity seriously while maintaining the capacity to find that local identity funny. The actual visual geography of the show, the buildings visible in the background of exterior scenes, is not invented. If you look carefully at the establishing shots that show the Griffin House against the wider world, you will notice a cluster of buildings visible in the distance behind the rooftops. These are not generic animated buildings designed to suggest a cityscape. They are specific, recognizable structures from the Providence skyline. Working from left to right, from furthest to closest, they are One Financial Plaza, the building at 50 Kennedy Plaza, and the Industrial National Bank building, which is now known as the Bank of America Tower. The perspective from which these buildings are shown is so specific that urban geographers and fans with detailed maps of Providence have been able to calculate, with reasonable precision, where the fictional neighborhood of Spooner Street must be located if the geography were real. The angle places the Griffins neighborhood primarily to the west of downtown Providence, in the territory of Johnston, Cranston, or North Providence. MacFarlane himself, in an interview with local Fox affiliate WNAC-TV, confirmed that the town was specifically modeled on Cranston. The show is set in a fictional place, but it is haunted by a real one. Every single time you see that Providence skyline in the background of a Family Guy exterior shot, you are looking at a photograph-accurate representation of how that city's downtown looked when a young animation student was walking through it every day and filing every detail of it away for future use. There is one more piece of this foundation story that almost nobody discusses, and it involves the real human being whose voice became Peter Griffin. MacFarlane has confirmed in multiple interviews, including a particularly detailed conversation with the Paley Center for Media, that Peter's voice was based on a real person. His name was Paul Timmons. He worked as the director of public safety at RISD during MacFarlane's time as a student there, and he was a man with a big, thick Rhode Island accent, a volume that seemed to operate without any relationship to the quietness of the spaces he occupied, and a complete absence of whatever internal editor most people have that tells them when they have said enough. MacFarlane would see Timmons multiple times a day crossing the campus and would stop to talk. He would smoke a cigarette with him. He absorbed the particular music of Timmons' voice, the way it extended certain vowels, the way it attacked the beginning of words, the loudness of it in relation to the world around it, and translated it into the voice of a fictional man in a fictional Rhode Island town. In 2013, a local ABC affiliate in New England tracked Timmons down for a news story about his inadvertent fame. He was in his 60s by then, still in Rhode Island, still the person whose voice was Peter Griffin. He said he was very proud of the connection and then added, with the specific kind of deadpan honesty that New England produces in its people, that he was clearly the visual inspiration for Peter, and that this meant the character of Peter was an idiot, but that he was proud of it nonetheless. He mentioned that Seth had been a brilliant student, that he used to see him several times a day, and that he had always known the boy was going somewhere. The real Peter Griffin, in case this fact brings you any comfort, was a reasonable and decent man who wore a white button-down shirt and glasses to work, and was proud of the student who borrowed his voice for one of television's most enduring cartoon characters. Drop a comment right now telling me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is wherever you are. I love seeing these pour in from all over the place. And if you haven't subscribed yet, take 2 seconds and do it. It makes a real difference for this channel. Section 2. The voice behind the curtain. The impossible talent of Seth MacFarlane and how 4 distinct personalities live inside one human throat. There is a quality that the very best voice performances have that is difficult to describe precisely, but immediately recognizable when you experience it. It is the quality of inevitability. The sense that the voice you are hearing could not belong to any character other than the one it belongs to. That the voice and the character were always the same thing. That they grew from the same seed. That separating them is not merely difficult, but actually impossible. The voice of Peter Griffin, with its particular wheeze of a laugh, and its loud, unfiltered New England commentary on everything, sounds like a voice that could only belong to Peter Griffin. The voice of Stewie, that refined, slightly menacing British precision, clipped and certain as a blade, sounds like a voice that could not exist outside of that small yellow shirt and red suspenders. Brian Griffin's easy, slightly sardonic American baritone sounds like a man who has read every important novel of the 20th century and would very much like you to know it. Quagmire's rapid-fire, slippery rat-a-tat delivery sounds like a voice generated by a personality that is always 3 steps ahead of the conversation, always moving toward the next opportunity. All 4 of these voices come from the same human throat. From Seth MacFarlane, sitting in a recording booth switching between 4 completely distinct personalities that exist simultaneously inside him. This is the hidden architecture of the show's central performances. And it is worth examining carefully because understanding how these voices were developed tells you something important about how the show understands its own characters. Let us begin with Stewie because the origin of that voice is perhaps the most surprising and specific of all of them. In a 2010 interview, MacFarlane described reading a biography of Alan J. Lerner, the lyricist who co-wrote the stage musical My Fair Lady and subsequently the celebrated 1964 film adaptation. MacFarlane had always been a passionate admirer of My Fair Lady. He knew the film intimately, knew the songs, knew the performances. But in the biography of Lerner, he came across a description of how Rex Harrison, who played Henry Higgins in the film, had approached the challenge of his musical numbers. Harrison was famously not a singer in any conventional sense. He had a reedy, precise, aristocratic English-speaking voice with a quality of effortless authority baked into every syllable. But he could not hold a note in the way that a trained theatrical performer holds a note. What he developed instead was a technique that came to be called speech singing. He delivered his songs with the rhythmic and tonal precision of a classically trained actor, inhabiting the notes just enough for the performance to be technically classified as singing while maintaining the complete illusion of natural, unconstructed conversation. The effect was that his songs sounded like particularly musical speech, rather than like speech that had been formatted into song. MacFarlane was fascinated by this. He began practicing a version of Harrison's voice, initially just experimenting with the texture of it. The clipped consonants, the lofty vowels, the sense that every word was being delivered from a position of absolute confidence in its own correctness. As he played with this quality of the voice, he began pushing it further. He made it more exaggerated, more theatrical, added an edge of menace, stripped away the warmth that Harrison had brought to Higgins, and replaced it with something colder and more calculating. He took Rex Harrison as Henry Higgins in My Fair Lady and made him simultaneously younger, more sinister, more theatrical, and more absurd. And then he placed that voice inside the body of a 1-year-old baby in a yellow shirt and red suspenders. The comedy of this is multiple and simultaneous. The contrast between the voice and the body is the surface joke. An infant speaking like a Bond villain is inherently funny. But the deeper comedy is what happens when you follow the logic further. This is not just a funny voice placed in the wrong body. This is a complete and internally consistent personality. An interior life of extraordinary sophistication and ambition, a set of intellectual and aesthetic standards that most adults could not meet. A coldness of purpose and a fluency in the language of power and manipulation. All of it trapped inside a creature that needs someone else to change its diaper. The gap between the voice and the body is not just funny, it is, when you sit with it, genuinely poignant. Stewie is not able to do the things his mind is capable of imagining. He is imprisoned in infancy. Everything he says and everything he builds is in some way a response to this fundamental unfreedom. Stewie's voice has a layer to it that most viewers are aware of but have perhaps not fully processed. In Season 16, in an episode called Send in Stewie Please, written by Gary Janetti, who was one of the original writers on the show in its early seasons, Stewie visits a therapist and, in a moment of genuine emotional openness, reveals that his British accent has been a performance all along. His real voice, the voice he uses when he allows himself to be unguarded, sounds like a blend of Peter and Brian. It sounds American. It sounds ordinary. The accent, Stewie explains to his therapist, is nothing more than an affectation, a coat of armor that he constructed so that he could feel special, so that he could navigate a world in which he feels profoundly, perpetually out of place. He is surrounded by people who cannot understand him, and who, when they can hear him at all, choose not to take him seriously. The British accent is his defense against all of this, a way of announcing with every syllable that he is fundamentally different from the people around him, that whatever they think they know about what he is, they're wrong. Gary Janetti has said in interviews that this revelation felt deeply and genuinely true to the character to him. He said it connected to something real about how children who feel like outsiders behave, how they construct personas, build facades, perform versions of themselves that they believe will make them seem more interesting or more powerful, or simply more unlike the people who make them feel small. Stewie's British accent is an act of self-invention by a child who needed to invent a self that could survive. The show acknowledged the same instability in Stewie's voice years earlier in a much more playful way. In the Season 10 anthology episode, Viewer Mail 2, there's a sketch in which the entire Griffin family is depicted as British, an alternate universe version of the household in which everyone speaks with an English accent. Everyone, that is, except Stewie, who in this universe speaks in a stereotypically broad American drawl. The implication is clear. Stewie is not inherently British. He is inherently different. In whatever version of the Griffin family he is born into, he will be the one who speaks unlike everyone else. He will always be the outsider, defining himself in contrast to the world around him. Whether that contrast takes the form of a British accent in an American family, or an American accent in a British one. Peter's voice developed more gradually than Stewie's, and it has a history that even dedicated fans of the show may not fully know. In the very earliest episodes of the first season, The voice is slightly different than the version that became standard. A touch rougher, a touch less smooth, with slightly different placement of the wheeze and a different relationship between the speaking voice and the laugh. This early version is audible if you go back and watch the first season carefully, particularly in the first several episodes. The voice evolved as the show found its footing, as MacFarlane became more comfortable with the character, and settled into the specific sound that would define Peter for every subsequent season. The laugh, that particular wheezing, helpless, slightly embarrassing laugh that has become one of the most recognizable sounds in American television comedy, was largely improvised during the early recording sessions. MacFarlane has described the laugh as coming from experimenting with sounds in the recording booth, trying different things and seeing what felt most genuinely funny rather than most technically accomplished. The laugh that landed was the laugh that stayed. It is not a polished sound. It is not a sound that announces itself as performance. It is the sound of a man who finds himself genuinely amused and has no particular interest in concealing it. Brian Griffin is, as MacFarlane has acknowledged on multiple occasions and in multiple forms, the character whose voice requires the least technical performance. Brian sounds like Seth MacFarlane having a conversation. When Brian speaks, you are essentially hearing MacFarlane's actual speaking voice, possibly modulated with a slight deepening, a touch more deliberateness in the delivery, but essentially unperformed, or performed with so much skill that it becomes indistinguishable from the natural. This is why Brian has consistently been described as the character closest to MacFarlane himself in terms of personality, worldview, and general sensibility. The similarity is not just a narrative choice, it is audible. It is present in every line Brian delivers. When Brian is wrong, when he is pompous or self-deceiving or hypocritical, there's a specific quality to how the voice sounds in those moments, a quality that makes the wrongness feel particularly intimate. Quagmire emerged from a very different source than the other three. MacFarlane has cited old radio commercials from the 1950s as a primary influence on the character's vocal quality. The rapid-fire, relentlessly cheerful, sexually suggestive advertising copy that was a staple of American broadcasting during that era. Characters in those commercials spoke quickly, with a kind of frantic forward momentum, and there was frequently an undercurrent of innuendo in the way products were pitched to a general audience that assumed a shared understanding of certain adult realities without ever making those realities explicit. MacFarlane took this specific energy, the combination of verbal speed and perpetual insinuation, and pushed it to its logical extreme, removing the product entirely and leaving only the personality. The result is a voice that sounds like it is always auditioning, always selling, always arriving at the next thing before the current thing has fully resolved. Quagmire speaks fast because he is always moving. He has never in his life stopped long enough to doubt himself. Beyond these four central characters, MacFarlane voiced literally hundreds of others across the show's enormous run. By some counts, he is credited with over 700 separate voice performances across the series, which makes him one of the most prolific voice performers in the history of American animation relative to a single show. Each of these additional characters requires MacFarlane to find a different pocket in his vocal range, a different quality of character that is distinct enough from all the others to register as a separate person. Tom Tucker, the pompous local news anchor, uses what MacFarlane has described as a gritty, authoritative tone that is slightly at odds with Tucker's actual incompetence. The voice of a man who has been performing authority for so long that the performance has become indistinguishable from the person. Dr. Hartman, the Griffin family's perpetually incompetent physician, has a breeziness that communicates dangerous confidence. Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's father, has the clipped authority of old money. The voice of a man who has never had to raise his voice because everyone around him has always been listening. The person who auditioned for Brian and did not get the part is someone MacFarlane himself has said he now considers might have been extraordinary in the role. That person was William H. Macy, the film actor whose credits include Fargo, Boogie Nights, The Cooler, and dozens of other significant dramatic and comedic performances. Macy auditioned for the voice of Brian Griffin in 1997, and he did not get the part. MacFarlane disclosed this fact on Twitter some years later, adding that he thought he had made a bad call. Macy had done voice work before. He had voiced a character called Leo Lionheart on an animated series called The Lionhearts, so the audition was not his first experience with the format. By the accounts of those present, he was genuinely good. But MacFarlane had always heard Brian in his own voice, and in the end, he trusted that instinct. Alex Borstein, who voices Lois, was recruited through the MAD-TV connection that had also been part of how MacFarlane first got to Fox. She was asked to provide a voice for the pilot while still working as a cast member at MAD-TV, and she has described the experience as genuinely sight unseen. She had not met MacFarlane before, had not seen any of his artwork, had no context for what the show was or what he was trying to create. The voice she brought to Lois was based on a character she had been performing in a Los Angeles stage show. A red-headed mother whose voice she had modeled on the specific patterns and rhythms of a real cousin of hers from Great Neck, New York. The initial version of the voice was slightly slower and somewhat deeper than the voice that became Lois. MacFarlane heard it and gave her a note that has since become somewhat famous in the small world of people who discuss the behind-the-scenes history of animated television. He told her to make it a little less annoying and to speed it up, because at the pace she was currently delivering the lines, every single episode of the show would be 4 hours long. Mila Kunis, who has voiced Meg since the second season of the show, auditioned through a more conventional process. After the departure of Lacey Chabert, who had voiced Meg in the first season and left due to time conflicts with her obligations on Party of Five and with her schoolwork, the role was recast. Kunis auditioned, was called back, was told to speak more slowly, was called back again and told to enunciate more clearly, and eventually convinced MacFarlane that she had the character under control. She was hired. MacFarlane has described Kunis's work as discovering something true about Meg through the process of the audition. Specifically, that Meg should be approached not as a character who is suffering, but as a character who is perpetually, actively embarrassed, which is a different and more specific and ultimately more useful quality than suffering alone. The story of how Chris Griffin found his voice is, by common agreement, the most surprising and most pleasurably absurd casting story in the show's history. When Seth Green came to audition for the role, the creative team had been hearing variations on the same voice for hours. Various shades of the clueless California teenager, the laid-back surfer type, the slightly dim American adolescent. These voices were all technically competent and completely interchangeable. Then Green came in with something nobody had expected or asked for. He had been dared by a friend and former co-star named Charlie Korsmo to audition using an impression of Buffalo Bill, the serial killer played by Ted Levine in Jonathan Demme's 1991 film The Silence of the Lambs. The specific concept, as Korsmo later described it to Page Six, was Buffalo Bill as an 11-year-old boy speaking through a public address system at a McDonald's. Green was amused by the dare, accepted it, walked into the audition, and delivered it with complete commitment. MacFarlane was thrown off. By multiple accounts, he was visibly startled and uncertain. He had not expected this. Nobody had expected this. But there was something about the complete wrongness of the choice, about the specific, committed oddness of Seth Green doing Buffalo Bill as a child, the sheer audacity of using a serial killer's voice as the template for an animated teenager, that was so genuinely funny in its refusal to be normal, that it worked in a way nothing else had all day. Green got the part. And years later, the show acknowledged this hidden history in a scene where Meg, seeking revenge on Chris for some minor offense, shows a video to the entire school of Chris performing the exact Buffalo Bill dance from The Silence of the Lambs. The show was telling the story of its own casting in the language of its own comedy. The joke only works fully if you know the backstory. For those who do, it is one of the purest pleasures the show has ever offered. MacFarlane's sister Rachel also contributed to the show's early history in a way that most people have never heard. Before the main voice cast was fully assembled, when MacFarlane was still working on the earliest pilot presentation materials and needed placeholder audio for every character, he turned to Rachel to record temporary lines for Meg. She read the character for those initial materials, giving Meg a voice that existed only long enough to be replaced. Rachel would go on to build a substantial career in animation in her own right, most prominently as the voice of Haley Smith on American Dad. Across both shows, there is a pleasing symmetry. Both MacFarlane's siblings contributing to shows that the other created. Both voices present in the early histories of franchises that would define animated television for a generation. Section 3. The Secret Architecture. What the show's setting is actually telling you. Every building in Family Guy was built by someone. Every color was chosen by someone. Every piece of sheet music visible on a piano in the background of a scene. Every newspaper headline readable only by someone who pauses the DVD. Every license plate and street sign and building in the background of an exterior shot. All of it was the product of a decision made by a human being sitting at a desk or a drawing board or an animation tablet. These decisions accumulate into the total visual world of the show. And that visual world is communicating constantly, saying things about the characters and their world that the dialogue never directly states. Start with the Griffin House. The address is 31 Spooner Street. This is not an invented address in a fictional location system. There is an actual 31 Spooner Street in Providence, Rhode Island. It sits immediately to the west of Roger Williams Park, which is one of the most recognizable landmarks in the Providence area, a large Victorian-era park designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, the same landscape architect who designed Central Park in New York City. The animators did not create a fictional address for their fictional family. They took a real address from the real city that had inspired the entire show and planted the Griffin family there. If you were to stand at the actual 31 Spooner Street in Providence, you would be standing in the neighborhood where, in the show's internal logic, the Griffin family lives and has always lived. The exterior of the house is a recognizable example of New England vernacular domestic architecture. A two-story wood frame structure with a modest front porch, set back from the sidewalk with a front yard that consistently appears to be slightly behind on its maintenance schedule. The house is neither grand nor truly modest. It is exactly the kind of house that a working-class family in an ordinary New England neighborhood would have owned during the 1970s and 1980s, when the show's cultural touchstones were being formed. It has the specific quality of a place that was once somewhat cared for, and that now continues to exist through the momentum of its own past effort, rather than through any current investment. The interior layout of the Griffin House has been maintained with more consistency across the show's long run than most animated family shows bother with. The relationship between the living room, kitchen, and staircase is broadly stable from season to season, which means the family exists in a coherent physical space. They live somewhere that can be mapped, that has a geometry that exists in 3 dimensions, even though it is rendered in 2. The living room places the couch facing the television, which means the family, when watching TV together, faces the same direction as the audience at home. This is a deliberate compositional choice that positions the viewers as being in the room with the family, in the same relationship to the screen that the family is in, rather than observing them from outside. Now, look at Lois's piano. It appears in the opening title sequence, in the scene where Lois and Peter sit together at a keyboard and sing the show's famous theme. If you have access to a version of the opening titles that is high enough resolution, and if you pause it and look carefully at the sheet music resting on the piano above the keys, you will see that the music is not generic decorative notation. It is the actual sheet music for the Family Guy theme song. The exact notes, the exact arrangement, the exact piece of music you are hearing as you watch. The people who animated this sequence took the time to create accurate sheet music for a real piece of music and place it in a location where, under ordinary viewing conditions, it would be impossible to read. The detail serves no narrative function. Its only function is to be true. The show is playing the theme and simultaneously displaying the sheet music for the theme, and trusting that the right person will eventually notice. The theme song itself has a backstory that most viewers have never been told. The opening sequence shows Peter and Lois at a piano, trading verses about the difficulties of modern television, before the family joins in for a conclusion that turns into a full theatrical production number. This format is a direct tribute to the opening sequence of All in the Family, the Norman Lear sitcom from the 1970s that MacFarlane has described in a 2014 Vanity Fair essay as arguably the greatest scripted program in the history of American television. The All in the Family opening features Archie and Edith Bunker seated together at a piano, singing about how things were better in simpler times. The famous lyric about how guys like them could use a little good luck. MacFarlane loved that opening with what he has described as genuine passion. The intimacy of two people at a piano, the way the song served as both character introduction and social commentary, the specific warmth of the domestic image containing the sharper critique. His tribute to it in Family Guy is deliberate and specific and loving. The music itself, all the underscore, the musical cues, and the elaborate original songs that the show periodically produces, was primarily the work of composer Walter Murphy across the show's most celebrated years. Murphy is a fascinating figure in the context of his Family Guy work, because his most famous composition before the show existed was so unexpected. In 1976, Murphy recorded a Fifth of Beethoven, a disco arrangement of the opening theme from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony that became one of the defining sounds of the disco era, a top 10 hit that is still recognizable to anyone who lived through that period of American popular music. The same composer who wrote a disco Beethoven record spent decades afterward creating the lush, orchestrally dense musical world of Family Guy, writing the show's elaborate musical numbers with a command of mid-century orchestration that complemented MacFarlane's own musical sensibilities perfectly. Murphy and MacFarlane won an Emmy Award for Outstanding Music and Lyrics for the song You Got a Lot to See, from the Season 2 episode Brian Wallows and Peter's Swallows. The song is an elaborate production number in which Brian takes an elderly shut-in named Pearl out to experience the outside world for the first time in years. It is played with full orchestral accompaniment and genuine emotional warmth. And it is the kind of piece that requires someone who knows not just how to make jokes in musical form, but how to make music that actually works on its own terms, that earns the comedy through its quality rather than relying on the comedy to excuse its flaws. The background details of Family Guy episodes have always been one of the most rewarding areas for attentive viewers to explore. In the episode Model Misbehavior, there is a scene where the Griffin family appears in the local newspaper. The headline and photograph are readable at normal viewing speed. But if you pause the image and look at the secondary headline at the bottom of the page, below the main story, it reads, DVDs paused for headline joke. Millions disappointed. The joke knows exactly what it is. It knows that people are going to use their pause button to look at this newspaper. It knows that those people are going to read the whole page. And rather than hiding a genuine secondary joke in the lower half of the newspaper, it has decided to make the act of looking the joke itself. The reward for looking is being told that looking is funny. This is the show simultaneously appreciating and gently mocking the very behavior it is rewarding. In an episode where Peter takes part in a Tron-style racing scenario, at the moment when Peter accelerates away from the starting point, there is a message written on the wall behind him. The message is written upside down, which means it can only be read by someone who has either paused the image and flipped their screen, or who is watching with their television inverted. The message says, if you can read this, your TV is upside down. There is absolutely no reason for this message to exist. Nobody watching the episode at normal speed will ever see it. Nobody watching at normal orientation will be able to read it. It was put there by an animator who had a blank wall to fill and decided that what that wall deserved was an absurd joke that only a very small number of people would ever find, and that those people deserved something specifically for them, even though finding it required considerable inconvenience. In the Season 2 episode Love Thy Trophy, there's a moment where Stewie is shown playing with his building blocks. The blocks are arranged to spell a word. The word is redrum. For anyone familiar with Stanley Kubrick's 1980 adaptation of Stephen King's The Shining, this reference will land immediately. Danny Torrance, the psychic child at the center of that film, writes the word red rum across walls and mirrors while experiencing visions of violence. And the film reveals, through one of its most famous shots, that red rum is simply murder spelled backward. The joke is perfectly designed for Stewie. It is the kind of dark literary reference that his character would appreciate and construct. And it is hidden well enough that only viewers who both pause the episode and recognize the reference will ever find it. The show trusted the right viewers to find it, and the right viewers did. The buildings visible in the background of exterior scenes carry their own information. The Providence skyline appears consistently across the show's run, and different animation studios rendered the same buildings slightly differently, which means that a careful viewer can sometimes identify a shift in production studios simply by looking at how the background buildings are drawn in a given episode. This is not something the casual viewer would ever notice, but it is something that people who have watched every episode multiple times in careful sequence have documented extensively. The buildings function as a kind of production watermark, the visual fingerprint of whichever studio produced any given episode. The Drunken Clam, the bar where Peter and his friends gather, was designed to capture a very specific quality of New England dive bar. Wood-paneled, poorly lit, smelling of old beer and decades of cigarette smoke, furnished with the specific combination of mismatched chairs and sturdy tables that suggests nobody has thought about the interior design since approximately 1975. This is the bar where working-class men go to be working-class men among other working-class men, away from the things that make them feel inadequate. The Clam is not trying to be anything other than what it is, which is the quality that makes it exactly right for Peter and his circle. James Woods Regional High School, where Meg and Chris are students, is named for the actor James Woods because the real James Woods attended high school in Providence, specifically the Moses Brown School, and his connection to Rhode Island made him a natural fit for a name that the show would use repeatedly. The fictional school bearing his name became, over the seasons, the setting for numerous significant storylines, and James Woods himself appeared as a version of himself in several early episodes. Apparently comfortable with having his name on a fictional institution of questionable academic reputation. Brown University appears in the show with a level of geographic accuracy that reflects how carefully MacFarlane observed his surroundings during his ISD years. In the episode The Story on page 1, when the family visits Brown for Meg's college application visit, the Van Wickle gates in University Hall are depicted with recognizable fidelity to the actual architecture. Brian Griffin's backstory includes his time as a Brown undergraduate, which adds a particular irony to the ongoing comedy about Brian's intellectual pretensions. He is not pretending to have been educated. He was actually educated at one of the most prestigious universities in the Ivy League. His failure as a writer is therefore not a matter of opportunity denied, but of potential unrealized, which is, if you think about it, a considerably sadder thing. Section 4. Characters who almost never existed. The casting near misses, abandoned designs, and alternate histories. Every character on Family Guy was at some point not a character on Family Guy. This is obvious in the general sense that before the show existed, nothing about it existed. But it is specifically true in a more interesting sense. Every character as we know them was shaped by a series of decisions that could have gone differently at any point. And at every one of those decision points, there's an alternate version of the show that diverges from the one we know. Understanding those near misses and alternatives tells you something important about the nature of creative work, about the randomness and accident that underlies things that appear inevitable in retrospect. Peter Griffin's visual design went through multiple iterations before arriving at the character we recognize. McFarlane's earliest sketches, produced while he was still working on the thesis film and the first Larry shorts, depicted a somewhat different figure. Less round, slightly more angular in certain places, with different proportions between the head and the body. The evolution toward the specific, recognizable silhouette of the Peter we know, the perfectly spherical belly, the circular head with its small chin and large glasses, the specific way his body distributes its mass, was gradual. At one point in the development process, the visual design was noticeably more angular than it would become. The decision to make Peter rounder and softer is a decision rooted in the fundamental grammar of animation. Circles are funny in a way that straight lines and sharp angles are not. Round shapes suggest harmlessness, even when the character using them is doing something terrible. Round shapes make people instinctively sympathetic to whatever they are describing. Peter Griffin's body is designed to keep you on his side even when he does not deserve it. The relationship between Peter and Brian in the show's earliest conception was substantially more equal than it eventually became. The initial creative vision placed the two characters in a relationship of rough parody, not just as best friends, but as the twin poles around which the show's comedy revolved. They were both protagonists, both central, both necessary to every scene. The Griffin family, in this earliest version, existed more as context and setting than as a cast of characters in their own right. As development continued, the show evolved toward a more conventional family sitcom structure, with Peter at the clear center and all other characters arranged in relationship to him. But the remnants of the earlier, more Brian-centric conception are visible in those first seasons, where Brian's role in the narrative sometimes feels like that of a co-lead rather than a supporting character. The show was still deciding what it wanted to be, and there is a version of early Family Guy where it becomes a show about an odd couple, a dumb man and his smart dog, rather than a show about a dysfunctional family that happens to include a smart dog. Stewie's initial character design went through significant revision. The football-shaped head that became so utterly specific to the character, that elongated oval skull that makes Stewie visually unlike any other character in the history of mainstream animation, was not the original intention. There were early design iterations in which Stewie's head was more rounded, more conventionally baby-like, more aligned with how animated infants typically appear. The football shape emerged through the design process and settled into something so specific and so right that it became impossible to imagine the character without it. The elongated skull serves the character in a way that is almost musical. It gives the head a visual formality, a quality of having been designed rather than simply grown, that rhymes with the formality of the voice and the designed quality of the personality. Stewie does not look like a baby who happened to become evil. He looks like someone built to be exactly what he is. The character of Meg went through a development process considerably more complicated than most people realize. Beyond the multiple casting changes that occurred with the voice, from Cree Summer, who was hired for the pilot materials and let go before recording a line, to Lacey Chabert in the first season, to Mila Kunis from the second season onward, there were substantive creative conversations about what kind of character Meg should be. One avenue of development that was explored would have made Meg more actively comic, a character who drove her own storylines, who had more agency, who was the subject of humor because of who she was and what she did rather than because of how others treated her. This more autonomous version of Meg was gradually set aside as the show settled on the characterization that became standard. the passive, pathetic, perpetually humiliated teenager who exists partly as a target for everyone around her. Whether this was the right creative decision is a question the show itself periodically revisited. In episodes where Meg was written with genuine depth and complexity, but always returned to the same answer. Cleveland Brown's design as a character was specifically built as a foil for Peter, in terms of emotional register rather than intelligence. Where Peter is loud and impulsive, Cleveland was quiet and patient, almost impossibly so. Mike Henry, who voiced Cleveland and who had met McFarlane at RYSD, brought a specific quality to the voice. A near whisper, a gentleness that required the listener to lean in, a restraint that stood in comic contrast to the explosive loudness of the men around him. This quietness was the source of much of Cleveland's early comedy. The humor of a man whose default communication style is precisely wrong for the company he keeps. Cleveland would eventually leave Family Guy to anchor his own spin-off series, The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013, and then returned to Spooner Street afterward. His departure and return are themselves interesting chapters in the show's mythology, reflecting both the network's interest in expanding the Family Guy universe and the show's eventual recognition that some characters work better in specific configurations than they do on their own. Joe Swanson, voiced by Patrick Warburton, was introduced in the first season in a way that very deliberately positioned him as a corrective to Peter. He was capable, respected, physically impressive despite his use of a wheelchair, and admired by everyone in the neighborhood. The joke of his introduction was partially that Peter, a man who is none of these things, was jealous of him, threatened by his competence and his popularity. Over the seasons, the dynamic shifted considerably. Joe's disability became an increasingly prominent source of comedy in ways that moved from gentle to uncomfortable as the show continued. His marriage to Bonnie became strained. His relationship with his friends became more cynical. But Warburton's performance remained consistent throughout. That magnificent baritone, that quality of absolute physical authority, that slight bewilderment at the behavior of the people around him. And it continued to generate genuine comedy even as the character's circumstances became less sympathetic. Glenn Quagmire's vintage visual design, the retro bedroom decor, the anachronistic fashion sense, the quality of being a man who seems to have been assembled from components of the early 1970s bachelor archetype, was carefully constructed to generate a specific kind of comedy. Quagmire is a man frozen in an era that his present-day context has no place for, operating according to a set of values and assumptions about relationships and sexuality that were problematic in the 1970s and have only become more problematic since. There is something simultaneously funny and melancholy about the character, something that the best Quagmire episodes lean into. The comedy of a man whose identity is entirely contingent on an era that ended before many of his neighbors were born, who continues to operate by its rules with complete sincerity and perpetual bafflement at why they are no longer universally respected. Herbert the elderly neighbor began as one of the show's most deliberately uncomfortable running jokes. A character whose interest in young boys was treated as a persistent, unsettling quality, present in every scene, never directly acknowledged by the adults around him. Over time, the show built on Herbert in ways that complicated and deepened the initial characterization. There is an episode in the show's later seasons where we see Herbert as a young man, a soldier, young and vital, in love with a boy from his neighborhood who grew up to serve in the military. This brief glimpse into Herbert's past transforms the character momentarily, giving him a fully human interior life that the comedy of his present-day self perpetually conceals. The show is doing something genuinely strange in that moment, taking a character whose surface function is entirely about menace and finding, without excusing anything, a person underneath. The evil monkey who lived in Chris's closet is one of the show's most charming examples of a throwaway visual gag that developed through the force of fan enthusiasm into a character with a whole backstory. The monkey appeared initially as a background detail in Chris's bedroom, an unexplained presence, pointing at Chris with an expression of malevolent accusation, appearing and disappearing without comment. Fans noticed it. They found it funny in the specific way that completely unexplained things are funny when they appear in serious settings. The show noticed the fans noticing and began including the monkey more deliberately. Eventually, the writers were obligated to explain it, and the explanation they created was one of the show's most deliberately absurd pieces of retroactive mythology. The monkey was not evil, it turned out. The monkey was suffering from a broken relationship and had been acting out because of personal pain. The monkey had a life story. The character designed to be inexplicable was given the most complete explanation the show could devise. Not because the explanation was better than the mystery, but because answering the question was more fun than leaving it unanswered. Before we move on, there's a guest casting story worth including that illustrates something true about how the show has always operated. Robert Downey Jr., the actor, the eventual Iron Man, the man with an Academy Award, and a career that had been recovered from the lowest possible depths through a combination of talent and extraordinary personal effort, personally telephoned the Family Guy production office and asked whether he could contribute to an episode. His motivation, apparently, was that his son was a devoted fan and talked about the show constantly. The producers created a character specifically for Downey to voice. That character was Patrick Pewterschmidt, Lois's secret older brother, a man who had been committed to a mental institution after witnessing his mother having an affair with Jackie Gleason, and who, after his eventual release, began murdering fat men. This is not a role that appears on the typical resume of a two-time Academy Award nominee. Robert Downey Jr. voiced a serial killer who strangles overweight people. He embraced the role with complete enthusiasm. The episode was warmly received, and the character returned in a subsequent season. If this tells you anything about the culture of Family Guy, it is this. The show has always been a place where surprising things are possible, including Academy Award winners accepting roles that their agents probably advised against. Section 5. The real people hiding inside every character. Characters in long-running shows are never invented from nothing. They are assembled, consciously and unconsciously, from observations and memories and fragments of real human beings that their creators have accumulated over lifetimes of paying attention. Understanding which real people live inside the fictional characters of Family Guy is one of the most intimate ways to understand what the show is actually about, what the people who created it were actually thinking about, what kind of lives they had lived before they sat down to make the show, what kinds of human beings they had been studying and loving and exasperating them for years. Peter Griffin is, as we have established, built partly from the voice and physical presence of a real security guard named Paul Timmons. But Peter is not entirely Timmons. In conversations about the character's deeper origins, MacFarlane has described his father's circle of friends as formative material. Growing up in Connecticut, his father had friends who were large, opinionated Irish Catholic men from New England. Men who had grown up working class in a region that rewards and celebrates a certain kind of working class loudness. Men who said exactly what they thought at the volume at which they thought it, and who had no interest in adjusting their presentation for the comfort of anyone who preferred their opinions more quietly expressed. These men were, in MacFarlane's own words from interviews, bursting at the seams with personality. They were simultaneously infuriating and deeply lovable, their loudness coming from a place of genuine warmth rather than cruelty, their certainty about everything coming from a confidence in their own experience of the world rather than from any contempt for other people's. Peter Griffin is the concentrated archetype of this specific type of New England working-class man. He is the version of these men that MacFarlane distilled from years of observation, turned up several degrees, and placed inside a cartoon. He loves his family with complete, unsophisticated sincerity. He says exactly what he thinks. He has very specific opinions about beer and sports and television programs from the 1980s. He has no internal monologue, no editor between thought and word, no mechanism for adjusting his behavior based on social context. These qualities make him both endlessly funny and, in the show's best moments, genuinely moving. Lois Griffin's voice, as Alex Borstein has confirmed, was based on a real cousin of hers from Great Neck, New York, a woman whose specific vocal rhythms and patterns Borstein absorbed without entirely intending to, and then found herself using when asked to provide a voice for an animated mother. But Lois's broader personality draws on a tradition of depicting American motherhood that is traceable to specific television antecedents that MacFarlane openly admires. Edith Bunker from All in the Family is the clearest influence, a woman whose patience with her husband looks, from the outside, like weakness and looks, from closer up, like a form of superhuman strength. The choice to be patient is always a choice. It is always work. Lois makes that choice in every episode, and the comedy of her character comes from the distance between the patience she maintains and the provocation she receives. Brian Griffin is MacFarlane himself, rendered in animated dog form and given the freedom to be wrong in ways that MacFarlane's own public persona is constrained from being. Brian's failed novel, the manuscript he has been working on for years, perpetually in progress, never finished, always discussed as though completion is imminent, and always revealed to be as distant as it has ever been, is a remarkably candid self-portrait by a creative person who has achieved enormous commercial success while perhaps still harboring the kind of literary ambition that commercial success can never quite satisfy. The novel is the thing that would prove something if it were finished. Brian's inability to finish it is the comedy and the sadness simultaneously. Mayor Adam West was voiced by the actual Adam West, which meant that the character was always a kind of collaboration between the fictional mayor of a fictional Rhode Island town and the real actor who had spent decades being associated with a specific role. West had played Batman in the 1966 television series that defined many people's first encounter with the character, and he had carried that association for the rest of his career. Not always comfortably, sometimes with frustration, but eventually with a kind of grace. His appearance in Family Guy gave him a place to be funny about the weight of his own legacy, to play a version of himself that existed in that specific space between the actual person and the cultural figure. He was enthusiastic about the role from the beginning. He found genuine comedy in the character. He appeared in the show consistently until his death in 2017, and when he died, the show allowed the character to die with him. Mayor Adam West did not get a replacement voice. The character was retired when the man who gave him life was gone, which is, in retrospect, one of the more quietly moving tributes a comedy show has ever paid to a performer who mattered to it. The character of Angela, Peter's boss at the Pawtucket Brewery, was voiced by Carrie Fisher. Princess Leia, one of the most iconic figures in the history of American popular culture. A woman whose voice carried 40 years of beloved associations every time it was heard. Fisher was an enthusiastic voice performer who brought genuine craft and warmth to the role. When she died unexpectedly in December 2016, MacFarlane confirmed that she had already recorded lines for 2 additional episodes of the current season, and that those appearances would air as planned because that was what she had committed to, and that commitment should be honored. Her final appearance aired in December 2017, almost exactly a year after her death. The decision to air those performances rather than replace them or remove them was a choice about honoring the reality of loss, about letting the audience have these last moments with a performer they loved, even knowing that the performer was gone. The real people hidden inside the show extend to figures who appear as themselves in ways that make the line between performance and reality genuinely blurry. James Woods played a fictionalized version of himself in several early episodes. a vain, self-absorbed, celebrity in decline version of the actor that the real James Woods was apparently willing to engage with in good humor. The choice to cast real celebrities as fictional versions of themselves is a comedy device with a long history in American entertainment. But it works particularly well in Family Guy because the show's willingness to be unkind about the celebrities it depicts creates a dynamic where the celebrity's willingness to participate in the unkindness becomes itself a kind of comedy. Being the subject of a Family Guy joke and being willing to voice that joke yourself is a form of self-awareness that the show rewards with affection. Frank Sinatra Jr., who appeared in the show as a character who served as a kind of mentor figure for Stewie, occupied a special place in the show's history because of his relationship to MacFarlane's deepest musical loyalties. MacFarlane reveres Frank Sinatra Sr., reveres him as a performer, as a musician, as an interpreter of the American songbook, as the embodiment of a certain kind of masculine grace and emotional intelligence that MacFarlane has spent his own career trying to honor through his own music. Getting to work with Frank Sinatra Jr., to have him in the recording booth, to hear his voice, which carried its own echoes of his father's, telling stories and delivering lines, was for MacFarlane a form of intimacy with a legacy that mattered to him profoundly. The episodes featuring Sinatra Jr. have a quality to them that fans notice, even if they cannot always articulate why. They are warmer, more nostalgic, more careful. They are the episodes that reveal what the show looks like when it is made by someone who loves something very much and has been given the chance to say so. When Sinatra Jr. died in March 2016 at 72, the response from the Family Guy production team was genuine grief. Not the managed, public relations variety of grief that organizations produce when someone associated with them dies, but the kind of grief that comes from having shared time with someone and then losing that person. This quality of genuine feeling toward the people who contributed to the show, this willingness to mourn them honestly when they are gone, to allow their deaths to matter within the show's mythology rather than recasting or erasing or simply moving on, is one of the things about Family Guy that tends to get overlooked in discussions of the show's merits and failures. The show has always had a relationship to mortality that is more honest than most comedy is willing to be. Section 6. The episodes that were never supposed to air. Every season of Family Guy produces material that, for various reasons, does not make it to American broadcast television as originally planned. The reasons vary and are not always the same kind of reasons. Sometimes the network decides a subject is too risky. Sometimes the Federal Communications Commission is an obstacle. Sometimes real-world events overtake a joke and render it impossible to broadcast without cruelty. And sometimes the people making the show create something that the people distributing it are simply not willing to stand behind, for reasons that may or may not have to do with the actual quality of the work. The first and most famous banned episode is When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, written for the third season. The episode's premise involves Peter arriving at the conclusion that he needs a Jewish business advisor to help manage the family's finances, a premise that walks an extremely fine line between satire of anti-Semitic stereotypes and reproduction of them. The episode contains an original song called I Need a Jew, set to the melody of the Disney classic When You Wish Upon a Star, from the 1940 film Pinocchio. Here, the legal complications began. Born Company, the music publisher that owns the United States copyright on the Pinocchio melody, filed a copyright infringement lawsuit arguing that the song was not protected parody under the First Amendment because it used the copyrighted melody without meaningfully commenting on the original song itself. It was using the tune for a new satirical purpose, they argued, rather than parodying the original work. Fox refused to air the completed episode. It did not appear on American broadcast television. However, it did air on Adult Swim, Cartoon Network's adult programming block, which had different content standards and a different relationship with controversy. It was also released on DVD, on Dottie. In 2009, 6 years after the episode was first completed, a federal judge ruled that Family Guy had not infringed on Bourne's copyright, finding that the transformation of the song for comedic use was protected under the First Amendment's guarantee of free speech. The episode that had been too controversial for Fox to broadcast was vindicated by federal court. An animated comedy's legal battle over a parody song resulted in a significant clarification of First Amendment protections in entertainment. This is the kind of sentence that would be impossible to predict and yet somehow seems perfectly appropriate for this particular show. The second major suppressed episode is Partial Terms of Endearment from Season 8. The premise involves Lois agreeing to become a surrogate mother for a married couple, one of whom is voiced by Julia Sweeney, who was a cast member on Saturday Night Live in the early 1990s, and later known for her monologue show, It's a Wonderful Life. When both members of the couple are killed in a car accident during Lois's pregnancy, Lois is left carrying a child that no longer has intended parents, and she must decide what to do. The episode does not approach the situation as pure comedy. It makes real arguments on both sides of the debate. The characters engage with the ethical dimensions of the decision with a genuine seriousness. The resolution is honest rather than convenient. By the standards of what the show was typically willing to produce, this episode represented a genuine attempt at thoughtful engagement with a difficult subject. Fox refused to air it anyway. And then, in a move that speaks to how much the network wanted the episode to simply not exist, Fox specifically requested that Adult Swim also decline to air it. Adult Swim honored this request. The episode aired in the United Kingdom in the summer of 2010, where its subject matter was considered less politically explosive, and it was eventually released on DVD in the United States. McFarlane disclosed the existence of the banned episode at San Diego Comic-Con in 2009, transforming something that the network might have preferred to quietly shelf into a publicized controversy that generated considerably more attention than simply airing the episode would have. This is a pattern that the history of censorship repeats constantly. The act of suppressing something gives it a power and an audience that it would not have had if it had simply been allowed to exist. The episode screams of silence. The story of Brenda Q occupies a different position in the show's history of controversial episodes, because it was not banned. It aired, it was watched, and then it was almost universally condemned. The episode depicts domestic violence through a storyline involving Quagmire's sister Brenda and her abusive boyfriend Jeff. The men in Brenda's life, led by Quagmire, decide that the correct response to the situation is to murder Jeff. The episode was apparently intended to be a serious-minded treatment of a genuinely serious subject. What it produced instead was something that most critics and many viewers experienced as deeply and specifically wrong. Not because the subject matter was inappropriate for comedy, but because the show appeared to have no idea how to actually handle the subject matter, and the collision between the show's typical tonal register and the gravity of what was being depicted created something deeply uncomfortable that managed to be neither good comedy nor good drama. The Boston Marathon episode, Turban Cowboy, has already been touched on, but deserves full treatment here because the circumstances of its withdrawal from the schedule represent one of the most instructive examples in television history of the relationship between comedy and real-world tragedy. The episode aired on March 17th, 2013. It contained two plot elements that, considered separately, seemed like unrelated satirical premises. Peter winning the Boston Marathon by driving through the runners, and Peter inadvertently becoming involved with a terrorist cell and accidentally triggering two explosions. These two premises existed in the episode simultaneously, but were not narratively connected to each other. They were two different comic premises in the same story, the way that many episodes of the show contained two different comic premises in the same story. On April 15th, 2013, 29 days after Turban Cowboy aired, bombs exploded near the finish line of the actual Boston Marathon, killing 3 people and injuring hundreds more. The attack was carried out by 2 brothers using homemade pressure cooker bombs. The bombing was immediately and correctly identified as a terrorist attack, and within hours of the bombing, clips from Turban Cowboy, specifically the sequence of Peter driving through marathon runners and the sequence of the accidental bomb detonations, were being shared on social media, presented by some users as evidence that the show had predicted the attack. This was false in the most straightforward possible way. The episode had been made and broadcast before the attack occurred, which means it could not have predicted the attack. And the association between the episode's content and the real bombing was the product of coincidence combined with the particular vulnerability of comedy to becoming entangled in tragedy. MacFarlane expressed genuine distress about the situation. Fox pulled the episode from rotation and removed it from streaming services. It was treated as an episode that needed to not be findable, at least for a period, out of respect for the people who had been affected by the real bombing. The episode was eventually restored to availability, and it is now discussed with the understanding that its relationship to the Boston Marathon bombing was entirely coincidental. But the experience of its withdrawal illustrates something real and important about what it means to make comedy about specific places and specific activities. Anything can become associated with catastrophe. Comedy that engages with the real world, real cities, real events, real human behaviors, always carries the possibility that the world will catch up to it in ways that were impossible to predict. There's also a category of material that never made it to broadcast for smaller, less dramatic reasons. Jokes removed in the final weeks before air because a celebrity died, or was involved in a scandal, or did something that made a planned joke feel either too easy or too cruel. The lead time for an animated episode is approximately 9 to 12 months, which means the writers are always writing about a world that won't exist by the time their work is broadcast. Jokes that were perfectly judged in June can feel devastating in April. The people who make the show have spoken about this experience, the sudden need to cut something that had been in the script for months because the world has moved in a way that makes it unwearable. These removed jokes leave no public record. They exist only as absences, as decisions made in quiet editing rooms by people who are trying to do right by the audience and by the subjects of their comedy simultaneously. Section 7. The Cutaway Gag, a complete history of the show's most celebrated and most controversial comedy device. The cutaway gag is the grammar of Family Guy. It is the thing that the show invented its specific reputation on, the device that made it recognizable, the technique that separates it from every other animated comedy that came before or after. It is also the subject of more critical debate and creative controversy than any other element of the show. Understanding the cutaway, not just what it is, but where it came from, how it was developed, what it was originally designed to accomplish, and how its relationship to the rest of the show changed over the decades, is the most productive way to understand what Family Guy actually is. The mechanism is simple enough to describe briefly. A character says something that references a comparison or a memory. This is worse than that time, or this reminds me of. And the show interrupts the main narrative to show a brief image of whatever is being referenced, or something tangentially related to it, or something completely unrelated to it that is nevertheless funny in its own right. The image plays, the show cuts back, and the main story resumes as though the interruption never happened. The cutaway has no relationship to narrative time. It is a parenthetical, a footnote, a piece of information that the show inserts between sentences of its primary text. This format has antecedents in comedy history that go considerably further back than Family Guy. MacFarlane and his writers were drawing on a tradition that includes Monty Python's Flying Circus, which built its entire structure on the principle of the narrative interruption. Scenes that began, derailed, restarted, got interrupted again, until the very idea of narrative continuity became the subject of satires. The tradition includes the sketch comedy programs of the 1970s and 1980s, particularly SCTV in Canada and the early seasons of Saturday Night Live, which regularly interrupted their own sketches with tangential or unrelated material. It includes the specific grammar of classic television commercials, which MacFarlane has cited as an influence on his broader sensibility, in which a brief visual premise was established, complicated, and resolved in approximately 30 seconds with maximum economy of storytelling. But Family Guy systematized the cutaway in a way that was genuinely new. Previous comedy programs had used the narrative interruption, but they had used it irregularly, as a special device deployed in specific circumstances for specific effects. Family Guy made the cutaway a reliable, recurring element of every episode's structure, a move that audiences could anticipate, that set up its own rhythmic expectation, that trained viewers to look forward to the departure from the main story, and to reward the show when the departure delivered something funny. The cutaway became, over the first few seasons, part of the show's contract with its audience. It was something you knew was coming. The pleasure was in not knowing what form it would take. The first episode of the show, Death Has a Shadow, which aired on January 31st, 1999, contained cutaways. The format was part of the show's identity before the show had an audience. It was not introduced gradually, not added later as a refinement. It was there from the beginning in the first episode ever broadcast, as a foundational element of the show's comedic language. The trigger phrases that initiate cutaways are themselves part of a carefully developed vocabulary. This is worse than the time functions as the most common formulation, and it works because it promises something extreme. Whatever is about to be shown is worse than the current situation, which is already bad enough to generate the comparison. This reminds me of works similarly, but with different emotional coloring, a slightly more neutral, less desperate quality. Characters can also trigger cutaways simply by beginning a comparative sentence and letting the screen complete it, which creates a kind of completion ritual between the show and its audience. The character begins the sentence, the show delivers the visual punchline. The audience feels the satisfaction of a pattern fulfilled. The writing process for cutaways is different from the writing process for the main story. Executive producer Steve Callahan has described a writer's room culture in which writers pitch cutaway ideas through performance. They stand up, act out the concept with improvised sound effects and voices, essentially perform the cutaway for the room in real time. The test is whether the performance makes the other writers laugh immediately within the first few seconds. If a cutaway requires context, explanation, or setup to generate a reaction, it is not a good cutaway. The cutaway must contain everything necessary for its own comedy. It must be self-sufficient. What made the early cutaways especially effective was their brevity. In the first 3 seasons of the show, a typical cutaway lasted 2 to 4 seconds. It established a situation, delivered a joke, and exited before the audience had finished processing what they had seen. This created a specific comedic rhythm, a joke that finished slightly before you expected it to finish, leaving a brief gap that the next joke would fill. The density of this approach made the early episodes feel genuinely frantic in a pleasurable way, like a show that was delivering more comedy than you could fully absorb. As the show's seasons progressed, the cutaways grew longer. This is one of the most documented and discussed changes in the show's history. Episodes from the middle and later seasons often contain cutaways that last 30 seconds, a minute, or longer. The reasons for this change are multiple and interconnected. Longer cutaways take more time to fill, which means episodes can meet their runtime requirements with fewer total elements. The additional time in any given cutaway provides opportunity for comedy that builds and escalates, rather than arriving in a single instant. And, here's the more uncomfortable reason, longer cutaways are easier to produce when the writing room is struggling, because they allow the show to pad its way to a full episode through the amplification of individual gags rather than through the generation of new ones. The South Park critique of the cutaway format deserves careful attention because it was delivered publicly and forcefully and had enough apparent truth in it to generate a response from other shows in the animated television ecosystem. In 2006, South Park aired a two-part episode called Cartoon Wars, in which Trey Parker and Matt Stone depicted Family Guy's writing process as involving manatees who randomly combined idea balls to generate unconnected comedic premises. The implication was that the cutaway comedy was essentially random, that the connection between any individual cutaway and the episode it appeared in was arbitrary, that you could swap any cutaway from any episode into any other episode and nothing would change because none of them were connected to anything meaningful. MacFarlane acknowledged the criticism without accepting it, noting that he and the South Park creators were making fundamentally different kinds of comedy with fundamentally different structural approaches, and that both approaches were legitimate. He has also noted privately that Parker and Stone made a show that was, in many ways, structurally the opposite of Family Guy. Densely plotted, thematically coherent, with comedy emerging from the logic of its characters and situations rather than from random insertion. Whether that makes South Park's comedy superior or simply different is a question that audiences have been debating for decades without resolution. What is harder to dispute is the subsequent observation that multiple writers from both The Simpsons and King of the Hill reportedly contacted Parker and Stone after Cartoon Wars aired to thank them for making the episodes. These were writers from shows that aired on the same network, on the same nights, as Family Guy. Their private gratitude to South Park for articulating a critique they had apparently also been thinking suggests that the critique had resonance within the professional animation community beyond just being a competitive jab. The Conway Twitty gag, perhaps the most famous and most polarizing single-running joke in the show's history, is the cutaway format taken to its logical extreme and then pushed a step further, past the logical extreme and into a different territory entirely. Conway Twitty was a country music singer who died in 1993. He was enormously successful during his lifetime, with a long series of hit records and a devoted fan base, but he was not the kind of artist whose posthumous cultural presence was particularly vigorous. He was not a legendary figure in the way that Sinatra or Elvis are legendary figures. He was a highly skilled practitioner of a popular genre who had a devoted audience and then died and was mourned, and is now remembered primarily by people who loved him during his lifetime, and by fans of Family Guy. In multiple episodes across several seasons, the show cut away from the main narrative not to a comic scene or a brief joke, but to a complete, unedited live performance of Conway Twitty performing one of his songs. The performances lasted several minutes. There was no punchline. There was no twist. The show returned to its main narrative when the song ended, having offered the audience nothing in exchange for their time except the experience of watching Conway Twitty perform a song they probably had not expected to watch. The first time the gag appeared, it worked as a pure shock. Nobody expected it. The unexpectedness itself was the comedy, and the bewilderment of watching an entire country music performance in the middle of an animated comedy generated genuine laughter through sheer wrongness. The third and fourth times the gag appeared, it had become something different. It was the show saying with complete explicitness, we are choosing to not give you a joke here. We are choosing to give you a Conway Twitty song instead of a joke. And we are doing this because we believe that this choice, the choice to give you a Conway Twitty song instead of a joke, is funnier than any joke we could provide. Whether this is true depends entirely on your theory of comedy, and the arguments are genuine on both sides. There is a moment in the season 10 episode Back to the Pilot that reveals the show's own understanding of what the cutaway does to its characters. Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the first episode of the show. While they are there, they observe the original characters standing around in the main scene, and they witness something that is both a visual joke and a piece of genuine self-analysis. During a cutaway, the characters have nothing to do. They are suspended in narrative amber while the show is elsewhere. The time travelers observe the original characters just standing there, waiting in silence for the cutaway to end so they can continue. The show was acknowledging, through its own comedic grammar, that the cutaway format creates a gap in the characters' existence, a pause in their lives during which they are simply not present. It is a crack in the illusion, and the show chose to make the crack visible rather than ignore it. What makes the cutaway problem simultaneously a symptom and a cause of the show's evolution is that the relationship between the two is self-reinforcing in a specific direction. As the show leaned more heavily on cutaways, the narrative structure of each episode became lighter. Thinner plots, less character development, more time allocated to tangential gags. This lighter structure made the show more dependent on cutaways because there was less substance in the main story to carry the runtime, which meant more cutaways, which meant a lighter structure, which meant more cutaways. Breaking this cycle required something that the show proved capable of doing on rare and memorable occasions. The Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie is the clearest example. In this episode, Brian and Stewie are accidentally locked in a bank vault over a weekend. The entire episode takes place in this single location. There are no cutaways. There are no random gags. The episode is simply two characters, talking to each other with genuine honesty, having the kinds of conversations that the main show's format never allows time for. Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box because he has, at times, considered ending his own life. Stewie reveals the full depth of his love for Brian and his terror at the thought of losing him. It is an episode that exists in a completely different register from the show's normal mode, and it demonstrates, compellingly and conclusively, that the talent and the craft to make something genuinely moving were always there. The cutaway was a choice, not a constraint, and choosing not to use it revealed what could be done without it. Section 8. The predictions. When comedy and reality became uncomfortable neighbors. Family Guy has been making observations about American culture and celebrity behavior for over 25 years. In that time, it has made a very large number of jokes about a very large number of topics, people, and situations. Some of those jokes have subsequently been complicated by real-world events in ways that transform the comedy into something that required more careful consideration. These are not predictions in any meaningful or metaphysical sense. They are the inevitable result of a show that pays very close attention to cultural patterns and occasionally finds that those patterns play out in reality in ways that align, with uncomfortable precision, with what was said in a joke. The Kevin Spacey reference is the most instructive single example because of what it reveals about the ecosystem of rumor and inside knowledge that the entertainment industry perpetually maintains. In a 2005 episode, Stewie Griffin is shown running through a shopping mall shouting that he has escaped from Kevin Spacey's basement. MacFarlane has said in interviews that the joke was not written by him specifically, that a writer brought it to the room, that a rumor involving Spacey and some kind of incident was the basis for the line, but that the full nature of whatever allegations existed at that time were not known publicly. The network allowed the joke because, in the context of the specific rumor circulating, it seemed to be referencing something relatively minor. In 2017, 12 years after the episode aired, Anthony Rapp publicly disclosed that Spacey had made inappropriate sexual advances toward him in 1986 when Rapp was 14 years old. Rapp's allegation was followed by multiple additional allegations from other individuals, and Spacey's career was destroyed by the accumulated weight of the accusations. The joke from 2005, seen in retrospect, was not prescient. It was based on information, incomplete, unverified, shared through the informal channels through which industry knowledge circulates. that the writers had access to and chose to deploy in a form that was deniable and comedy-shaped. The show did not predict the future. It heard something, formed a joke around it, and then the thing it had heard turned out to be more substantially true than the joke implied. This is how the industry works. It always knows more than it says. The comedy is often the safety valve through which what is known can be expressed without requiring anyone to stand behind it publicly. The Caitlyn Jenner references are a different and more complex case because they stretch across multiple episodes and represent a sustained pattern rather than a single joke. Beginning in the late 2000s, the show began depicting Bruce Jenner, the 1976 Olympic decathlon gold medalist, who had spent subsequent decades as a prominent presence in American celebrity culture, including through the Kardashian family, in increasingly feminine terms. In the episode We Love You, Conrad from Season 7, Stewie says that he cannot believe Brody Jenner came from Bruce Jenner's body. And when Brian corrects Stewie on Bruce's gender, Stewie dismisses the correction and describes Bruce as an elegant, beautiful Dutch woman. In a separate episode, Bruce Jenner is depicted as a flamboyant cheerleader performing for military personnel. These references were made well before Caitlyn Jenner's public transition in 2015. The creators of the show have declined to explain extensively why they depicted Jenner this way. The most reasonable interpretation, given the broader pattern we have established, is that the references were based on the same kind of industry-level awareness that informed the Spacey joke, a knowledge of what was being said in circles that did not produce journalism. The jokes were plausibly deniable when they were made, and their accuracy was only visible after the fact. Whether this makes them insightful or simply opportunistic depends on what you believe about the responsibility that comes with access to private information about public figures. The Robin Williams alignment was, among these coincidences, the one that most genuinely disturbed the people involved. In the season 12 episode that aired in 2013, Peter wishes that everyone in the fictional town were Robin Williams. The episode includes a storyline in which the presence of Robin Williams everywhere becomes so overwhelming that a character attempts suicide. This premise was dark and was played for dark comedy. When British channel BBC Three aired the episode in August 2014, the timing became catastrophic. The episode aired on the same day that news broke of Williams' death by suicide, at the age of 63 after a period of worsening mental and physical health. The channel had no way to know this would happen. There was no mechanism for pulling the episode from the schedule in time. The episode continued to air as the news reports appeared and spread. The experience of watching a fictional storyline about the inescapability of Robin Williams on the day that the real Robin Williams died was described by those who witnessed it as genuinely disturbing in a way that lingered for years. The Boston Marathon sequence, which ran a month before the actual Boston Marathon bombing, has been discussed at length, but it is worth adding one final observation. The episode was not removed from availability permanently. It returned to a rotation. It is currently watchable. Its connection to the real bombing is acknowledged when the episode is discussed, but the episode itself exists and can be watched by anyone who chooses to watch it. This outcome, the comedy surviving its terrible coincidence and eventually being reintegrated into the normal flow of the show's catalog, says something about how time affects the relationship between comedy and real tragedy. The wound heals. The joke becomes possible again, though it is never quite the same joke it was before the wound happened. Barry Manilow came out as gay in 2017, years after the show had depicted him in an episode serenading Quagmire with a love song intended as a gag about incongruity. Charlie Rose was depicted as a man whose polished exterior concealed something messier, in a joke that turned out to be accurate in ways the joke had not imagined. Ellen DeGeneres was shown, in a cutaway, speaking over her guests in a way that suggested a darker side to the cheerfulness of her public persona. a joke that felt prescient in 2020 when allegations about her treatment of staff became public. Each of these instances follows the same basic pattern. A joke that drew on industry knowledge or cultural observation, made before the fuller truth was public, that acquired additional meaning when the fuller truth emerged. What connects all of these instances is not clairvoyance. It is the specific function of comedy as a repository for things that can't yet be said directly. Comedy is the format in which cultural societies process their anxieties about things they know but cannot fully acknowledge. When a joke about Kevin Spacey or Caitlyn Jenner appears in a show in 2005 or 2009, it is not the joke seeing the future. It is the joke articulating, in a format that does not require proof, what is already known in some form by some people. The show is the conduit through which that knowledge finds its way to audiences who do not have access to the circles where the knowledge circulates. Years later, when the knowledge becomes public, the joke looks like a prediction. It was not a prediction. It was a window. Section 9, The Hidden Connections. How the mythology of Family Guy links every character to every other. Family Guy has been on the air for over 25 years. In that time, the show has established an internal mythology, a dense web of backstory, relationship, implication, and revealed history that extends far beyond what any single episode makes visible. The characters have pasts that predate the narrative. They have connections to each other that are only hinted at in passing references. They have secrets that are disclosed, sometimes years after the audience has been living with them, in offhand lines that completely recontextualize everything that came before. Peter Griffin's family history is one of the show's richest and most carefully constructed backstories. The episode Peter's Progress from Season 7 reveals that Peter is descended from a man named Griffin Peterson, who founded the fictional town in the 17th century after being exiled to the New World from England, and who won permanent control of the settlement by defeating the king in a talent competition. This founding myth gives the Griffin family a dynastic claim to their surroundings that most animated family shows do not bother to construct. The Griffins did not simply end up in this town through the ordinary accidents of American mobility. Their family name is in the town's founding myth, hidden in plain sight across every episode of the show. Peter's biological parentage contains a secret that the show revealed in Season 5 in the episode Peter's Two Dads. The story establishes that Peter's biological father is not Francis Griffin, the harsh, emotionally withholding Irish Catholic man who raised him, but rather a man named Mickey McFinnigan, whom Peter's mother had a relationship with outside of marriage. Peter meets his biological father and develops a complicated relationship with him, and the episode uses this revelation to reframe aspects of Peter's character that had previously been treated as simply given. His Irishness, his working-class pride, his combination of warmth and recklessness. These qualities, it turns out, were not produced by the family environment he grew up in. They were inherited from a parent he never knew he had. This reveal also provides a retrospective context for the tension in Peter's relationship with Francis Griffin, the man who raised him. Francis was cold, demanding, often emotionally withholding, in ways that went beyond the normal severity of a strict Irish Catholic father. The knowledge that Francis may have known or suspected that Peter was not his biological son adds a layer of explanation to the distance between them that the show had always depicted but never fully explained. The love was complicated. The paternity was complicated. The family was built on a secret that shaped every relationship within it. Lois's family background is a world of hidden wealth, hidden dysfunction, and hidden history. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, is, in the show's mythology, enormously rich. A figure whose wealth is so substantial that it functions as a force of nature in the family's interactions, a constant presence that shapes the dynamics between Lois and her parents. But the Pewterschmidt family has its own secrets. Lois has a brother, Patrick, whose existence was kept hidden from her by her parents for decades. Patrick was committed to a mental institution after witnessing his mother having an affair with Jackie Gleason. Not a fictional version of the entertainer, but the actual man who appears in period flashback. This detail places the Pewterschmidt family in direct contact with mid-century American celebrity culture in a way that is both completely absurd and, within the show's mythology, entirely consistent with the specific combination of privilege and dysfunction that characterizes this household. The Pewterschmidts had connections. They moved in the circles where Jackie Gleason would appear. And something that happened in one of those circles sent a young man to an institution where he would remain for decades, while his sister grew up not knowing he existed. Stewie's relationship to the rest of the family is perhaps the most philosophically complex connection in the show's mythology, because it has always been characterized by a fundamental ambiguity about what kind of being Stewie actually is. Can the other characters hear him? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, and the inconsistency is never fully explained. What is consistent across every season is that Brian can hear Stewie and understands him and responds to him as an equal. Brian's relationship with Stewie is therefore the relationship that allows Stewie to be known, to be genuinely in communication with another conscious being who takes his interior life seriously. In a household that either cannot hear Stewie or chooses not to understand him, Brian is the only reliable witness to who Stewie actually is. This is a profound thing to build into a friendship. It gives the Brian-Stewie relationship an emotional weight that functions independently of whatever comic premise any particular episode builds around it. The giant chicken is a figure who seems, on the surface, to be pure absurdism. A large chicken who fights Peter across epic multi-episode set pieces for reasons rooted in an expired coupon. But the mythology of the giant chicken has been carefully constructed across dozens of appearances. The chicken's name is Ernie. This was revealed briefly in a single episode and confirmed by the production team. Ernie has a life outside his encounters with Peter. He has a wife. He has a home. He has presumably ongoing concerns and responsibilities that have nothing to do with his periodic catastrophic battles with the Griffin family patriarch. The gap between the epic scale of their violence and the mundane origin of their conflict, an expired coupon at a restaurant, is the entire joke. But the joke only works because the show has committed fully to both sides of the gap. The violence is genuinely spectacular. The coupon was genuinely just a coupon. When the show's executive producers confirmed in 2024 that Ernie had died, not in an episode, not dramatically, but simply that he had gone the way of all flesh, an off-screen death mentioned in response to a direct fan question, the news had a strange sadness to it. A character who had been part of the show's mythology for 25 years was gone, and the audience hadn't been there for it. Herbert the elderly neighbor has, as we have established, a backstory that complicates the surface function of his character. There is an episode in the later seasons where we see Herbert as a young soldier, in love with a boy from his neighborhood who grew up to serve. The glimpse is brief. The show does not linger on it or explain it extensively, but it is there, and it performs a specific function. It gives Herbert a fully human interior life that exists underneath the comedy of his present-day self. Every scene with Herbert carries, for viewers who know his backstory, a double register: the comedy of the creepy neighbor on the surface and the sadness of the person underneath. The show has always been at its most interesting when it allows these two registers to coexist without resolving into one or the other. Joe Swanson's arc across the show's seasons represents one of the more complete and coherent character trajectories in the show's history, even though it is never presented as such. Joe begins as the admired neighbor whose capability makes Peter feel inadequate. He becomes a full member of the friend group. His marriage goes through severe strain. His disability becomes increasingly treated as a source of comedy rather than as a character trait. His friendships become more cynical and transactional. The movement from the respected newcomer of season 1 to the figure who is periodically mocked by his own friends tracks with uncomfortable accuracy. What happens to people when they stop seeming special? When the novelty of their particular difference has worn off and what remains is just another person in a long-running social group, treated with the diminishing returns of familiarity. The friendships on Spooner Street, Peter, Joe, Cleveland, and Quagmire at the Drunken Clam, are built on the specific foundation of proximity and habit rather than deep compatibility. These men are friends because they live near each other, drink at the same bar, and have accumulated enough shared history that the friendship has become self-sustaining. They are not perfectly matched. They do not always bring out the best in each other, but they are there consistently across the years, and the consistency of their presence is its own form of loyalty. There is something true about this, about the friendships that form not because people choose each other, but because geography and time make the choosing unnecessary. Section 10. The Animation Secrets. What happens in the background and why it matters? Animation is a craft of decisions. Every line that appears on your screen is the product of a choice made by a human being. Every color, every shadow, every character movement, every background detail, every prop placed in a scene, each of these represents a specific decision made in the production pipeline that could have been made differently, that was arrived at through iteration and judgment and compromise and the particular preferences of the studio that was doing the work at that particular moment in the show's history. Family Guy has been animated by a large number of different studios across its long run. The original episodes were produced at Grimsam and Sunwoo Digital, South Korean studios with extensive experience in American television animation. Their work on the first season has a quality that fans often describe as rough around the edges but alive. The lines have a slightly imprecise quality. The movements have an organic looseness. The whole visual texture of the show carries the marks of hand-drawn animation in a way that is less polished than later seasons, but in some ways more charming. There is a quality of visible effort in the early episodes that later, more technically accomplished work sometimes lacks. Rough Draft Studios, which took over as primary animation provider beginning with the second season, brought a significantly higher level of technical sophistication. Rough Draft was one of the most respected studios in the world for television animation. They had done extensive work on Futurama and were known for the quality and expressiveness of their character animation. The seasons animated primarily by Rough Draft, roughly the middle portion of the show's run, are consistently cited by fans as the visual peak of the series. The character expressions are more nuanced. The physical comedy is executed with better timing, and the general quality of the visual execution matches the quality of the writing more completely than in either the earlier or later periods. Different studios have different visual signatures, and in a show that has worked with as many studios as Family Guy, these signatures can become visible to attentive viewers as a kind of production timeline. The outlines on characters become thicker or thinner. The movement style becomes more fluid or more rigid. The quality of the background art shifts. In certain transitions between studios, the move from one studio to another between Season 3 and the revival in Season 4, for example, the visual change is significant enough to notice even on a first viewing. McFarlane has been consistent in his commitment to traditional hand-drawn animation rather than computer-generated imagery. He has said in interviews that there is no shortcut for hand-drawn work, and that attempts to use computers to accelerate the process tend to produce results that announce themselves as computer-generated rather than hand-drawn. This commitment is part of why each episode takes approximately a full year to complete from first script to finished product, and why the show is always working nearly a year ahead of its broadcast schedule. The writers are perpetually creating comedy about a world that will not exist for another 12 months by the time their work reaches screens. This production timeline shapes the show's relationship with topical humor in a specific way. The long gap between writing and broadcast means the show generally avoids jokes about very specific current events, since a joke that was perfectly calibrated to a news story in June will have aged significantly by the following April when it airs. The comedy that works over this timeline is comedy about patterns and types, about human behavior and cultural tendencies that are stable enough to remain relevant across a year of geopolitical change and celebrity incident. This is why the show's best comedy tends to have a slightly timeless quality to it, even when it engages with recognizable cultural territory. The color design of the Griffin household deserves careful attention because it communicates information about the family's economic and aesthetic situation that the dialogue never directly states. The interior of the house is primarily a palette of mustard yellows, worn greens, and the particular shade of brown that carpets and furniture acquired during the 1970s and have never quite lost. These are not the colors of poverty. These are the colors of comfortable but unremarkable working-class life, a household that was furnished during an earlier decade, and that has not had either the resources or the motivation to substantially update itself since. The house is not shabby enough to suggest struggle. It is not elegant enough to suggest aspiration. It is simply there, the specific color of a life that is being lived without much particular attention to how it looks. Stewie's bedroom, by contrast, has been animated with technical specificity that reflects the character's personality. The weapons and machines that Stewie constructs are drawn with a level of internal consistency that suggests their designers were thinking about how these devices would actually work. The time machine, which appears across many seasons, has been depicted with enough visual consistency that fans have produced detailed diagrams of its design. This precision serves a comedic function. The absurdity of a baby in a diaper operating sophisticated technology is deepened by the sophistication of the technology itself. If the machinery looked crude and toy-like, the comedy would be smaller. The machines look real because Stewie is real, and the incongruity of his reality with his circumstances is the source of everything that makes the character work. The treatment of physical comedy in the animation has changed substantially across the show's decades. In the early seasons, physical harm is depicted in the tradition of classic American animation, a tradition that includes Looney Tunes, Tom and Jerry, and the physical comedy of the entire Warner Brothers animation library. Characters get hurt in exaggerated, cartoonish ways. They bounce back immediately. The visual language of injury is the visual language of slapstick. Stars and spirals around the head, rubber limb collapse, immediate recovery. This mode of depicting violence communicates, through visual convention, that nothing that happens here is real, that the comedy of physical harm is safe to enjoy because its unreality is legible in every line. As the show continued, this cartoonish mode was gradually replaced, in specific types of scenes, by more realistic depictions of physical injury. This change is visible in how the animation renders certain violent moments. The level of graphic detail increases. The recovery becomes slower and less complete. The injuries look more like real injuries rather than cartoon approximations of them. This shift was deliberate. The show chose to make its violence more visually realistic because it believed this would generate a stronger comedic or dramatic response. Whether the response it generated was actually funnier is the open question. The facial expression work in Family Guy operates in a deliberately restricted range. The characters do not achieve the grotesque extremes of expression that characters in more expressionistic animation can access. Peter's face, in particular, operates in a narrow band. He looks slightly confused in roughly the same way, whether he is mildly puzzled or profoundly bewildered. This consistency of expression creates its own comedy. The show does not show you what Peter is feeling through his face. It shows you the situation he is in and trusts you to understand what he must be feeling based on the situation. The face is a constant. The situation is the variable. Brian's expressions are the most emotionally nuanced of the main characters, and this is appropriate. Brian is the character with the most complex interior life, and his face is given more range to reflect that complexity. In his best moments, Brian looks genuinely like an animal, which is to say, like a creature whose interior life is rich and whose ability to fully communicate that interior life through available channels is always slightly insufficient. There is something in the best Brian animation that captures this particular sadness. The sadness of a person who feels things deeply and is perpetually unable to fully express what he feels. This is not incidental. It is a design decision that reinforces everything the character is supposed to be. Section 11. The Music Mysteries. Seth MacFarlane, Walter Murphy, and the Hidden Musical World of Family Guy. Family Guy is, at its core, a musical show. Not a musical in the formal genre sense. The show does not follow the conventions of the stage or screen musical as a primary mode of storytelling, but it takes music seriously in a way that most animated comedies do not. It produces elaborate, original songs with full orchestral arrangements. It performs parodies of Broadway standards and classic Hollywood musicals with genuine theatrical craft and affection. It honors a tradition of American popular music that most of its audience has no direct personal experience with. Understanding where this music comes from and what it means to the people who make it reveals something about the show's deepest artistic ambitions that the surface comedy often obscures. Seth MacFarlane is a genuinely accomplished singer. This is not incidental to understanding his work. He has released multiple studio albums of big band and jazz standards. Music is Better Than Words in 2011, No One Ever Tells You in 2013, and In Full Swing in 2017. He has performed these albums with full live orchestras and concert venues around the world. He has appeared at Carnegie Hall. He has performed with the New York Pops and other major orchestras. He is, by any reasonable standard, a legitimate concert performer and recording artist who also happens to make animated television comedy. His vocal range is baritone, with a quality that invites regular comparison to the mid-century American crooners he most admires: Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Tony Bennett, Bobby Darin. This is not coincidental admiration. These are the performers MacFarlane has studied most carefully, whose craft he understands most deeply, whose specific techniques and sensibilities have shaped his own. Walter Murphy was the ideal creative partner for this musical ambition. Murphy's career before Family Guy included the 1976 disco hit A Fifth of Beethoven, a successful dance rearrangement of the opening theme from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony that reached the top 10 of the American pop charts and became one of the defining sounds of the disco era. The man who made a disco Beethoven record then spent decades creating the lush, orchestrally dense musical world of an animated adult comedy, writing elaborate big band arrangements and Broadway-style production numbers with a command of mid-century musical conventions that matched and amplified MacFarlane's own musical sensibilities. Their collaboration produced work that was not just functional comedy music, but genuinely accomplished musical composition. Murphy and MacFarlane won an Emmy Award for Outstanding Music and Lyrics for the song You Got a Lot to See, from the Season 2 episode Brian Wallows and Peter Swallows. The song accompanies a scene in which Brian takes an elderly shut-in named Pearl out to experience the world, and it is a full orchestral production number, warm, emotionally genuine, beautifully arranged, that demonstrates the show's capacity to use musical form not just for comedy, but for something genuinely moving. The Emmy, which recognized the song as one of the outstanding musical achievements in American television that year, is a fact that tends to produce surprise in people who know Family Guy primarily as a show about crude comedy. The road to episodes are where the show's musical ambition is most fully realized. and they represent a body of work that deserves to be recognized, alongside the best musical episodes of any television show in the medium's history. The road to format was inspired by the Road to Comedy films starring Bing Crosby and Bob Hope, a series of 7 films produced between 1940 and 1962 that mixed adventure, comedy, and elaborate musical numbers, with Crosby and Hope playing versions of themselves in various exotic settings. MacFarlane, who admired these films deeply and had studied them carefully, created the Road to episodes as an explicit tribute to this tradition. The first episode, Road to Rhode Island, aired in Season 2 and was directed by Dan Povenmire, who would go on to create Phineas and Ferb. MacFarlane gave Povenmire a remarkable degree of creative latitude, telling him to fill whatever time was available with visual gags and to do whatever he wanted with the material. Povenmire returned to direct Road to Europe in Season 3 and Road to Rupert in Season 5, before leaving the show to develop his own series. The 3 Road to episodes he directed established the format's signature elements: a special version of the opening title sequence, custom musical cues that replace the show's normal underscore, elaborate original songs performed by Stewie and Brian, and parodies of classic science fiction and fantasy films. Each episode became a vehicle for the kind of musical and visual ambition that the regular episodic format did not often accommodate. In Road to Rupert, one of the most celebrated sequences involves Stewie dancing alongside Gene Kelly in a recreation of the Worry song number from the 1945 film Anchors Aweigh. In the original film, Gene Kelly danced with the cartoon character Jerry Mouse from Tom and Jerry, a celebrated technical achievement that combined live action with animation in a way that had never been done before at that level of sophistication. MacFarlane inverted this logic. He inserted an animated character, Stewie, into the original live-action footage of Kelly's performance, so that Stewie is the cartoon dancing with Kelly's flesh and blood performance. The technical challenge of making this combination feel smooth and natural, matching the animation's movement to Kelly's choreography, making the scale and lighting of the animated figure feel consistent with the original footage, was substantial, and the result is one of the most visually striking sequences in the show's history. Road to the Multiverse, which aired in Season 8 and is consistently cited as one of the show's best episodes, is built around a premise that allows the show to parody multiple different animation styles within a single episode. As Brian and Stewie travel between parallel universes, each universe is depicted in a different visual style, including a universe rendered in the graphic style of Robot Chicken, a universe in which everyone is drawn in the style of a Japanese anime, and a universe in which the entire cast is depicted as classic Disney animation. The Disney sequence, which includes an original musical number called It's a Wonderful Day for Pie, written in the specific visual and musical language of a 1930s Disney cartoon, with watercolor backgrounds, bouncing ball rhythm, and an orchestral arrangement that precisely replicates the sound of the Disney Studios' mid-century output, is both a technically exact parody and a genuine tribute. The show knew enough about Disney's musical language to replicate it with remarkable accuracy. And the pleasure of watching the sequence comes partly from recognizing the accuracy and partly from the affectionate quality of the imitation. Sheepoopy, the production number from Season 5's Peter's Got Woods, in which Peter celebrates a football victory by performing a full company rendition of the song from Meredith Willson's The Music Man, is perhaps the show's most celebrated pure comedy musical number. The joke operates through escalation. Peter begins performing the number alone on the football field, and the performance gradually recruits the entire stadium into participation until the whole world seems to be performing Sheepoopy together. The comedy is not in the song itself, which is a perfectly fine piece of 1950s Broadway pop, but in Peter's complete inability to recognize the social inappropriateness of what he is doing, and in the surreal logic of a world that responds to his enthusiasm by joining in rather than questioning it. The number requires real musical performance to execute well, and MacFarlane delivers it with the kind of commitment that makes the joke work. You cannot be ironic about Shipoopi and have the number function. You have to actually perform it. The FCC song from season 4 is one of the show's most explicitly political musical moments, a Broadway-style production number critiquing the Federal Communications Commission's authority to restrict broadcast content. The irony of a show that regularly tested FCC limits, producing an elaborate musical number criticizing those limits, was not lost on anyone involved. The song was written and performed with genuine musical craft. It is a properly constructed production number with verse, chorus, bridge, and a dramatic finale. In service of a point about censorship that the show was also making by the simple act of existing and saying the things it said. There is something pleasurably self-referential about the FCC song. The show is performing its own defiance in the most theatrical possible mode, announcing its rebellion through the grammar of the art form that the FCC was trying to constrain. The casting of Frank Sinatra Jr. And the show represents the moment when MacFarlane's personal musical loyalties and the show's entertainment ambitions most directly intersected. Frank Sinatra Jr., the son of the man whose musical legacy MacFarlane has spent his career honoring, appeared in multiple episodes, voicing a character who served, among other things, as a musical mentor to Stewie. The episodes featuring Sinatra Jr. were made with a level of care that reflects how much the casting mattered to MacFarlane personally. They are warmer, more nostalgic, and more meticulous than the surrounding episodes, as if the show was trying to be worthy of the name it had the privilege of working with. When Sinatra Jr. died in March 2016, the response from MacFarlane and the production team was the genuine grief of people who had spent time with someone who mattered and then lost that person. The music of Family Guy has always been, at its core, a tribute to the American musical tradition that MacFarlane most loves. The big bands and the crooners, the Broadway composers and the Hollywood orchestrators, the people who knew how to take a melody and give it the exact weight it deserved. Every song the show has ever produced, every musical number it has ever staged, is in some way a continuation of that tradition, a thank you note written in the grammar of the music it most reveres. Section 12. The Man Who Almost Wasn't There. Seth MacFarlane, September 11th, and everything that follows. From a missed flight. We arrive finally at the story that underlies everything else in this particular collection of secrets. Not because it is the most hidden, it is actually well documented, has been discussed in interviews, has been reported by numerous outlets over the years, but because it is the story that, if it had gone differently, would have meant that none of the rest of these stories existed. It is the foundation beneath all the other foundations, the fact that makes all the other facts possible. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, Seth MacFarlane was supposed to be a passenger on American Airlines Flight 11. The flight departed from Logan International Airport in Boston, bound for Los Angeles. Flight 11 was hijacked at 8:14 in the morning by 5 men acting in coordination with 3 other hijacking teams operating simultaneously on other flights. At 8:46 a.m., Flight 11 was deliberately flown into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. 92 people died on the aircraft. Thousands more died in the towers over the following hours. It was the deadliest terrorist attack in American history and one of the deadliest single events of any kind in the history of the United States. Seth MacFarlane was not on that flight. The reason he was not on the flight is, in its specifics, almost impossibly mundane. He had been in Rhode Island the night before, in the city where he had gone to school, the city that had given him the setting for his show, giving a lecture at his alma mater. After the lecture, he went out for drinks with friends. He stayed out later than he should have. He woke up the next morning with a hangover and a complicated relationship with the passage of time. His travel agent had also made an error in the departure information provided to him, listing the flight's departure as 8:15 a.m., when the actual departure was 7:45 a.m. The combination of these two factors, the hangover and the incorrect time, produced a McFarlane who arrived at Logan Airport approximately 10 minutes too late to board. The gate had already closed. He went to the airport lounge. He sat down. He fell asleep in a chair. He woke up approximately 40 minutes later. The news was on. Flight 11 had been flown into the North Tower. In the various interviews where McFarlane has discussed this, he has been asked whether the experience changed him, whether it made him feel that he was living on borrowed time, that he had been preserved for a reason, that he had a purpose he was now obligated to fulfill. His responses to these questions have been consistent and genuinely honest. He does not believe in fate. He does not believe that his survival had a cosmic dimension. He has missed other flights for comparable reasons, he says, and has not constructed those misses into narrative significance. He describes the following weeks as rattling, as something that took time to process, but says he has not carried the experience as a defining weight in his life and does not believe that is the appropriate response to a coincidence. This is worth taking seriously, not as false modesty, but as a genuine philosophical position. The alternative, treating every good thing that follows from a near-death experience as a testament to the meaningfulness of that survival, imposes a narrative structure on random events that those events do not actually possess. McFarlane survived because he overslept and his travel agent made a mistake. Other people died. The people who died did not die because they were less deserving of survival. They died because they boarded a flight that was hijacked. The asymmetry between these facts, between surviving for accidental reasons and dying for accidental reasons, cannot be resolved into a story that makes meaningful sense, and trying to force it into such a story does a disservice to everyone involved. Family Guy was in its third season when September 11th happened. The show was already experiencing the scheduling difficulties that would eventually lead to its first cancellation. Fox was moving it around the schedule, the ratings were uneven, the show's future was uncertain. The September 11th attacks sent the entire American television industry into a period of profound uncertainty. Networks pulled or delayed content that seemed potentially inappropriate. Shows that dealt with terrorism, aircraft, violence, or New York City were reconsidered. The creative environment for a show like Family Guy, irreverent, willing to engage with dark material, set in a New England city that was culturally and geographically proximate to Boston and New York, became suddenly and significantly more complicated. The show was eventually canceled, revived, and went on to produce more than 20 additional seasons. During those seasons, it made jokes about terrorism, about September 11th itself, about the Boston Marathon bombing, about all manner of things that touched on the specific territory of loss and violence and American vulnerability. Whether McFarlane's personal proximity to the September 11th attacks shaped any of these choices is a question that belongs to his interior experience and is not fully accessible from the outside. What we can observe is that the show continued and that its continuation required his presence, and that his presence on that Tuesday morning in September was the product of a hangover and a 15-minute scheduling error. Among the other passengers who died on Flight 11 was a man named David Angel. David Angel was a television writer. He was the creator and executive producer of the sitcom Frasier, one of the most critically celebrated and commercially successful comedies in American television history. A show that won 37 Emmy Awards during its 11-season run. A show that was at the time of Angel's death still considered one of the best things on television. David Angel was flying from Boston to Los Angeles on the morning of September 11th. He died at 8:46 a.m. when Flight 11 struck the North Tower. Two television writers, one of whom would become one of the most successful animators in the history of the medium, and one of whom was already one of the most successful comedy writers of his generation, were both scheduled to be on the same flight out of Boston on that September morning. One of them boarded the flight, one of them did not. The difference between them in that specific moment was 10 minutes and a travel agent's error. There is no lesson to be drawn from this that does not diminish something. The lesson is not that Seth MacFarlane was meant to survive. The lesson is not that David Angel was meant to die. The lesson, if there is one, is simpler and more uncomfortable than either of those. Events that change the world do not distinguish between the people they affect. They do not select for merit or readiness or significance. They happen, and their happening changes everything that follows. And the contingency of who is present and who is absent in any given moment is one of the most unsettling facts of human existence. Family Guy exists. All of its hidden details, its secrets, its near misses, and its musical tributes and its Easter eggs and its banned episodes and its coincidental predictions, all of it exists because a 27-year-old animation student overslept and his travel agent got the time wrong. This is the largest and least comfortable secret in the show's history. And it is not hidden at all. It is simply the kind of thing that, once you know it, you cannot fully unknow. Every episode you watch carries this weight somewhere underneath it, invisibly, the way all things carry the weight of how they came to exist. The hour is late. The room around you is quiet. Somewhere under the things we've covered tonight, under the security guard whose voice became Peter Griffin, under the Rex Harrison biography that gave Stewie his accent, under the dares made in waiting rooms, and the expired coupons that started decades-long wars and the Providence skyline embedded in every exterior shot, there are more layers still. There are seasons we haven't touched. There are characters whose full backstories would fill another evening. There are musical numbers with their own complete histories, banned episodes that circulate in the specific corners of the internet where suppressed things end up, animation details that only become visible after you've watched the same episode 30 times from different angles. The hidden world of this show is genuinely inexhaustible. This is, if you consider it, the best evidence that the show was made with genuine care by people who put things into it. Not because anyone required them to, but because putting them there was the right thing to do. The sheet music on Lois's piano that matches the theme song playing over it. The message on the wall that can only be read with the television upside down. The block spelling red rum in a baby's bedroom. The WWID license plate on Jesus's car. The Providence skyline in every establishing shot, precise enough to map. These details say someone was here, someone cared, someone believed that the right viewer would eventually find this and that person deserved to find it. If tonight helped you discover something you didn't know before, if a connection formed between something you'd seen and something you hadn't understood, then it did its work. Sleep well. The Griffin family will be there when you open your eyes again, with all their hidden architecture intact, ready to be explored. Before you close your eyes, hit the like button if this brought you something. It genuinely moves the needle for a channel like this one. Subscribe if you haven't yet. There are more nights like this ahead, more worlds to map in the quiet dark. From wherever you're watching, whatever time it is, take care of yourselves. We'll see you next time. End of script. Bonus Section 1. The Giant Chicken Wars. A complete history of Peter Griffin's most spectacular recurring enemy. There are running jokes in television comedy, and then there are running jokes that become their own genre. The giant chicken fights in Family Guy occupy a category that almost no other recurring element in American television comedy can claim to share. They began as a single, contained joke in the third season. They escalated over the course of many years into some of the most elaborate and cinematically ambitious sequences the show ever produced. And the specific way they escalated, each installment bigger, more expensive, more physically spectacular than the last, all of it generated by a conflict so trivially motivated that the disproportion between cause and consequence is the entire joke. is one of the clearest expressions of what Family Guy is doing at its best. The first fight happened in the season 3 episode Da Boom, though some fans point to a slightly different moment as the true beginning. The setup was quick. Peter was out doing some errands in the fictional town. A giant chicken offered him a promotional coupon. Peter accepted the coupon. The coupon turned out to be expired. Peter was annoyed. The chicken was presumably either unaware of or indifferent to this. And somehow, in the way that these things happen in the internal logic of animated comedy, this exchange of a bad coupon led to a physical confrontation of extraordinary and escalating violence. The fight sequence in that first episode established the template. The combat between Peter and the chicken would not be casual or brief. It would be comprehensive, staged across multiple locations, involving the full geographic range of whatever setting was available. And it would produce collateral damage on a scale that suggested neither combatant had any particular concern for the world around them. They fight in parking lots. They fight through buildings, crashing through walls and windows. They fall from great heights and recover immediately. They destroy vehicles, street furniture, architectural elements. The fight continues until one of them appears to have won, and then the sequence ends, and the show returns to whatever the main story was doing. The key innovation of the chicken fights, which distinguishes them from ordinary cartoon violence and from ordinary running gags, is that they are treated with complete visual seriousness. The camera work, the editing rhythm, the choreography of the combat, all of it is executed in the style of a serious Hollywood action sequence, rather than in the style of cartoon comedy. The jokes in the sequence are not jokes about the violence itself. The joke is the combination of the complete seriousness with which the violence is staged and the complete triviality of what caused it. An expired coupon, an overextended promotional offer, two parties who could at any point simply agree to let the matter go, who instead have committed to mutual destruction with everything they have. The chicken's name is Ernie. This was disclosed in a single brief moment across the show's long run, and then largely not repeated. Ernie, a name so ordinary, so entirely without menace, that it perfectly captures the character. A large bird going about his life handing out coupons, who was somehow drawn into a decades-long conflict that has cost him more than any promotional offer is worth. Ernie has a wife. In one of the fight sequences, the combat briefly intersects with what appears to be Ernie's domestic life, a home, a relationship, a context outside the fighting. This glimpse humanizes Ernie in the specific way that all the best Family Guy supporting characters are humanized. Briefly, without explanation, in a way that suggests a complete life existing outside the frame of the camera. The chicken fights became progressively more elaborate with each subsequent installment. The production values escalated. The geographic scope of the battles widened. The duration increased. What began as a few minutes of action in one location became sequences that spanned multiple locations across an episode, with their own internal narrative logic, their own escalation of stakes, their own moments of apparent resolution that are then overturned as the fight resumes. The show was not content to simply repeat the same joke. It was building on it, treating it as an ongoing narrative, honoring the history between these two characters even as the specific reason for the history remained as small as it had ever been. When the show's executive producers confirmed in 2024 that Ernie the Giant Chicken was dead, not in an episode, not dramatically, not with ceremony, but simply that the character had gone the way of all flesh and would not be appearing again. The news had a quality that genuine grief about fictional characters sometimes has. Ernie had been part of the show's mythology for most of its existence. His death was acknowledged off-screen, in response to a direct fan question, as if the show was acknowledging a loss that had already happened in private. The chicken who started a war over an expired coupon, who fought one man across dozens of spectacular battles over a quarter century, was gone. The wars were over, and the reason they had started remained as trivial as it had always been. Bonus Section 2: The Writer's Room. How Family Guy episodes actually get made. Most viewers interact with television shows purely as finished products. The episode exists, it is 22 minutes long, it contains a certain number of jokes, and it either makes you laugh or it does not. The process by which the episode went from a blank page to that 22-minute object is almost entirely invisible from the viewer's perspective. But understanding how Family Guy episodes are actually made, the specific process by which ideas move from the room to the screen, reveals something important about why the show sounds the way it sounds and feels the way it feels. Family Guy uses what is known in the television industry as a writer's room format. A group of writers, the exact number has varied across seasons, but typically between 10 and 15 people, gather in a room together and collectively develop the stories, dialogue, and jokes that eventually become episodes. The showrunner, or the designated episode writer, provides the initial direction and makes the final decisions, but the material itself is generated through collective conversation, argument, and improvisation. Executive producer Steve Callahan has described the specific culture of the Family Guy writers' room in interviews. Many of the writers have backgrounds in performance: stand-up comedy, improv, sketch comedy. This performance background shapes how ideas are pitched. Rather than simply describing a joke in words, writers will typically perform the joke. They will stand up, use their voice, use their body, act out the scenario with improvised sound effects and character voices, and essentially show the room what the idea looks like in action. The test of any joke is whether it makes the other writers laugh in the moment of the performance before it has been refined or developed. If you have to explain why it's funny, it isn't funny enough yet. This performance-based pitch culture produces a specific kind of comedy. The jokes that emerge from it tend to be physical, vocal, immediate. Jokes that work in performance before they work on the page. This is consistent with what Family Guy's comedy actually sounds like. Energetic, committed, sometimes rough, occasionally undisciplined, but always alive in the way that things generated through live performance tend to be alive. The show sounds like people are having a good time making it, even in the episodes where the final product is uneven, because the process that produces it is inherently social and energetic. The table read is another crucial stage in the production process. MacFarlane and Callahan have both mentioned that table reads, formal readings of the completed script by the full cast with additional people brought in from outside the regular production team to provide fresh reactions, are extremely important quality control mechanisms. The purpose of bringing in outsiders is to access the kind of laughter that comes from genuine surprise rather than familiarity. The writers and regular crew have heard these jokes dozens of times by the time a script is completed. They have become immune to the comedy through repetition. Bringing in fresh voices who are encountering the material for the first time allows the team to hear where the real laughs are and where the material needs work. The show has a lead time of approximately 9 to 12 months between the writing of a script and the broadcast of the finished episode. This long lead time is a consequence of the hand-drawn animation process, which is labor-intensive and cannot be significantly accelerated without affecting quality. During this 9 to 12-month period, the script goes through multiple revision stages. The voice actors record their lines, the recordings are sent to animation studios, the animated footage comes back and is edited together, the music is composed and recorded, the sound mix is completed, and the episode goes through whatever final revisions are required before it is ready to air. Because the writers are always working a year ahead of the broadcast schedule, they are always describing a world that will not exist when the episode reaches screens. The jokes they write in June will be heard by audiences in April. The cultural references they make in one season will be processed by viewers in the following season. This temporal displacement shapes the show's relationship to topical comedy. which is why Family Guy tends toward observations about durable patterns rather than specific current events, toward jokes about human behavior rather than particular incidents, toward comedy that will still make sense when the specific context of its creation has faded. The production of each episode also involves significant creative input from the animation studios, which is sometimes overlooked in discussions that focus entirely on the writers. Animation directors and animators bring their own interpretations to the material, finding visual gags and physical comedy in the scripts that the writers didn't plan for and couldn't fully anticipate. McFarlane has spoken about giving considerable latitude to directors like Dan Povenmire during the road to episodes, telling Povenmire to fill available time with visual gags and to do whatever he wanted with the material. And the results of this latitude are visible in the episodes Povenmire directed, which have a visual energy and inventiveness that reflects a director who is given real, creative freedom. This collaborative nature of the production process means that any given Family Guy episode is the product of dozens of creative contributions from people at multiple stages of production. The final joke you hear in an episode may have been conceived by a writer, modified at the table read, further adjusted during the voice recording, and then given an additional visual dimension by an animator whose name you will never know. The show is, in the truest sense, a collective work, shaped by many hands, each of which left some mark on it. Bonus Section 3. The lawsuits, the controversies, and the things the show said that it probably shouldn't have Family Guy has been sued, threatened with litigation, and the subject of formal complaints to regulatory bodies more times than almost any other show in American television history. This is not surprising given the show's content and its willingness to engage with material that other programs would not go near. But the specific cases and their outcomes reveal something interesting about the legal landscape of comedy in America, about what can and cannot be said in a work of fiction, about the limits of parody, and about the ways in which real people and organizations push back against being the subjects of jokes they did not consent to. The Carol Burnett lawsuit was one of the most publicized legal challenges the show ever faced. In 2007, the beloved comedian Carol Burnett filed a copyright infringement and right of publicity lawsuit against 20th Century Fox, seeking at minimum $2 million in damages. The lawsuit arose from an episode that depicted a character resembling Burnett's famous cleaning woman character, a bit she had performed on the Carol Burnett Show for years, identifiable by a specific mop bucket and blue bonnet, working as a janitor in an adult entertainment store. The depiction was paired with what Burnett's lawyers characterized as a slightly altered version of the musical theme from her show, used without permission. Fox's lawyers argued that Family Guy had a long-standing tradition of satirical parody, and that the depiction of Burnett was protected under the First Amendment's guarantee of free expression. A spokesperson for the studio noted, with some relish, that Burnett had built her career on parodying others, and that it seemed inconsistent for her to object to being parodied in return. On June 4, 2007, U.S. District Judge Dean Pregerson ruled in Fox's favor, finding that the Family Guy episode was protected parody and did not infringe on Burnett's rights. The case established a useful legal precedent for the show's ongoing practice of depicting real people and parodying real works. The Born Music lawsuit over the song I Need a Jew has already been described in the section on banned episodes, but it is worth mentioning again here in the context of the show's broader legal history. The ruling in that case, which found in 2009 that Family Guy's transformation of the When You Wish Upon a Star melody for comedic purposes was protected under the First Amendment, was a significant victory not just for the show but for the broader principle of comedic fair use in entertainment. Shows that parody existing works draw on this principle constantly, and having a federal court affirm its applicability to Family Guy helped clarify the legal environment for similar comedy elsewhere. The Parents Television Council filed multiple formal complaints against Family Guy with the Federal Communications Commission during the early and middle years of the show's run. The PTC, an advocacy organization focused on what they characterize as family-friendly content standards, placed Family Guy on their annual list of worst primetime programs for family viewing in 2000, 2005, and 2006. The FCC received numerous formal complaints about the show from viewers and organizations, and the show was the subject of regulatory scrutiny that most programming never faces. MacFarlane's response to these complaints was typically measured in public and characteristically direct in private. He has said that the show was clearly labeled as adult animation and aired in a time slot designated for adult content, and that viewers who found the content objectionable had the option of not watching. He has also said that some of the specific objections he found genuinely difficult to take seriously. That a show being accused of inappropriate content by people who had made watching inappropriate content their professional focus was a kind of absurdity that the show itself might have used as material. The Venezuela situation is a case study in the international reach of the show's comedy and its capacity to generate real diplomatic consequences. In 2008, Family Guy aired an episode called 420, in which Brian leads a campaign to legalize marijuana in the fictional town. This episode was broadcast internationally, as Family Guy episodes typically were. The Venezuelan government reacted with formal outrage. The country's justice minister cited the episode as an example of American programming promoting drug use, and cable stations in the country were officially warned that they would face financial penalties if they continued to air Family Guy. The fictional marijuana legalization campaign of a cartoon dog in a fictional Rhode Island town became the subject of a genuine government response from a sovereign nation. This is not unique in the show's history. Various moments across its run have generated formal objections or responses from governments, organizations, and public figures who found the content objectionable. The show has always operated with the awareness that its comedy has reached beyond the American living room, that the jokes made in a writer's room in Burbank are broadcast to audiences with very different sensibilities and very different relationships to the subjects being joked about. The show's approach to religious content has generated its own sustained body of controversy. Jokes about Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and various other religious traditions appear with considerable regularity. The show has depicted Jesus Christ as a character multiple times, in contexts that range from gentle to quite pointed. It has made jokes about the specific practices and beliefs of virtually every major religious tradition it has encountered. The Parents Television Council's objections often centered on these religious jokes as much as on the more straightforwardly adult content the show also regularly produced. MacFarlane's personal atheism, which has been openly expressed in interviews for his entire career, is present in the show's comedic sensibility in ways that are not always explicitly stated, but are consistently audible to those who are listening. Brian Griffin's atheism, his explicit, regularly expressed non-belief in God, is one of the clearest points of alignment between the character and the person who voices him. When Brian argues about religion, he is arguing about something that MacFarlane has thought about carefully and has arrived at a genuine position on. The comedy around religion and Family Guy has a specific quality that distinguishes it from the comedy around other sensitive subjects. It is not just edgy for the sake of being edgy. It is the comedy of a person who genuinely disagrees with the dominant cultural institution and finds the disagreement funny in ways that are simultaneously intellectual and emotional. Bonus Section 4. The Meg Rehabilitation. How the most abused character in the show eventually found her dignity. The arc of Meg Griffin's treatment by the show is one of the most discussed and most debated trajectories in the show's history. We have touched on this in earlier sections, but Meg deserves a dedicated exploration because the full story of her treatment and its eventual partial correction is one of the most instructive things the show has ever done. Instructive about what happens when comedy becomes cruel by increments, and about what it looks like when a creative team decides to take a corrective action. In the show's first 3 seasons, Meg was simply the least interesting member of an unusual family. The joke was not cruelty. The joke was contrast. Meg was ordinary, an ordinary teenager with ordinary problems, an ordinary social life, and an ordinary amount of self-consciousness. And the comedy came from placing her ordinariness against the backdrop of a family that was anything but ordinary. This is a perfectly respectable comedic premise. There is genuine comedy available in the figure of the person who just wants things to be normal, surrounded by people and situations that have no interest in normal. Meg, in the early seasons, was that person. And she was written with enough humanity to make her sympathetic, even when she was being used as the punchline of a contrast joke. The shift began with the revival in 2005 and accelerated across the subsequent seasons. The jokes about Meg moved from being about her ordinariness to being about her undesirability, and then from her undesirability to her active unlovability, and then from her unlovability to the premise that she deserved to be treated badly, that this was simply the correct response to her existence. The escalation was gradual enough that it was hard to identify the specific moment when it crossed from comedy into something more troubling. By the time you reach the seasons where Peter was farting in Meg's face as a casual form of entertainment, where the family treated her abandonment as a reasonable consideration, where the show was extracting laughs from the systematic dehumanization of a teenage girl, by that point, the original premise was unrecognizable. The episode Seahorse Seashell Party from season 10 is the moment the show most directly confronted what it had been doing to Meg. In this episode, Meg finally says everything she has been unable to say across years of accumulated mistreatment. She describes exactly what her family has done to her. She names it precisely, with the specific clarity that comes from having thought about something for a very long time. For viewers who had watched the show through all those seasons of escalating cruelty, Meg's speech had the quality of long-delayed justice. The character was finally saying what needed to be said, and the show was finally acknowledging what it had been doing. And then the episode's ending reversed everything. The aftermath of Meg's confrontation showed the family falling apart without her to serve as their collective target. And Meg, understanding this, voluntarily returned to her role as the person everyone picks on, because her suffering was what kept the family functional. The message this ending communicates is one that has been analyzed and criticized extensively, that victims should accept their victimization because the disruption of challenging it causes more harm than the original harm, that keeping peace requires someone to absorb all the damage, that the correct response to discovering your own mistreatment is to continue accepting it for the benefit of everyone else. Whether the writers intended to send this message or were simply following the comedic logic of a show that needed to reset to its status quo is something only the people who made it can say with certainty. What is certain is that the message is what the episode communicates, regardless of intention, and that many viewers experience the ending as both painful and genuinely irresponsible. The correction, when it came, was partial and gradual. Beginning around season 14 and building through subsequent seasons, the writing staff, which had by this point added more women, began pushing back against the systematic abuse of the show's main female teenager. Meg started getting episodes where she was competent, tough, and occasionally genuinely impressive. She began standing up for herself rather than simply accepting mistreatment. She was written as a character who had developed genuine resilience and strength through her years of difficult experience, rather than as a character whose defining quality was her ongoing victimhood. By season 22, the extreme abuse of Meg that had characterized the show through its middle decades had largely stopped. The credits for this change have been widely distributed to the additional women in the writing room, to changing cultural norms around the comedy of cruelty, to a simple creative recognition that the joke had been taken as far as it could go and then further and further past that point until it wasn't a joke anymore. Whatever the cause, the result was a Meg, who was beginning for the first time in many seasons to resemble the character she might have been if the show had made different choices 15 years earlier. The sadness of Meg's arc, viewed across its full length, is that the show always had the capacity to write her well. There are episodes scattered through even the worst years of her mistreatment where Meg is given genuine depth, genuine complexity, genuine emotional life. The crossover episode where she meets Lisa Simpson and discovers a talent for the saxophone. The episode where Peter's own history of childhood abuse is used to explain, without excusing, why he treats his daughter the way he does. The moments where Meg's perspective is actually centered, where the audience is invited to see the family through her eyes, rather than in relation to her. In all of these moments, the show proves that it knew who Meg was supposed to be. The tragedy is not that it couldn't write her well. The tragedy is that it chose not to for a very long time, and that the damage done to the character and to the viewers who saw themselves in her persisted long after the choice had been reconsidered. Bonus Section 5. The show that came back from the dead, the Adult Swim years, and the revival. That changed everything. No story in Family Guy's history is more frequently told than the story of its cancellation and revival, and no aspect of that story receives less attention than what happened in the specific years between the cancellation and the comeback. The Adult Swim years, when the show became something it had never been during its original broadcast run. Family Guy was canceled by Fox on February 14, 2002. This was the second time Fox had canceled the show. The first cancellation had happened within the show's original run and had been reversed quickly, but this second cancellation looked final. The writing staff was released. The production infrastructure was dismantled. The show's future on television appeared to be over. The first significant thing that happened after the cancellation was that Fox licensed the first 50 episodes to Cartoon Network for broadcast in their Adult Swim block. Adult Swim was a programming strategy that Cartoon Network had been developing for a couple of years. A late-night block of programming aimed specifically at adult viewers, running from 11 p.m. onward, distinct from the children's programming that the channel aired during the day. The block had launched in 2001 and was still finding its identity. It needed content. Fox had canceled content that was relatively inexpensive to license. The deal made practical sense for both parties. Family Guy's reruns premiered on Adult Swim on April 20th, 2003. The response was immediate and extraordinary. The show became the highest-rated program on the entire Adult Swim block. According to reports from the period, the reruns boosted Adult Swim's overall viewership by something in the range of 239%. An increase so large that it changed the character of the block and demonstrated the existence of an audience for irreverent adult animation that was much larger than anyone in the network television industry had recognized. Young adults, particularly men in their late teens and 20s, were not being served by anything on broadcast television at that hour, and Family Guy was exactly what they were looking for. The DVD releases amplified this effect. The first and second season DVD sets came out during this period and sold over 400,000 copies, a remarkable number for a canceled animated show that was no longer in production. People were not just watching the reruns. They were buying the show, watching it repeatedly, showing it to their friends, and telling those friends to buy it too. The word of mouth during this period was genuinely organic, driven not by marketing, but by viewers who had encountered something they loved and wanted other people to experience it. This combination of massive Adult Swim ratings and strong DVD sales caught Fox's attention in a way that the original ratings had not. The network that had canceled Family Guy twice had canceled it even after reviving it from a previous cancellation, found itself looking at hard numbers suggesting that the audience for the show was larger than the original broadcast performance had indicated, that the scheduling chaos Fox itself had created by moving the show from time slot to time slot had artificially suppressed the show's reach, and that the appetite for new episodes was genuine and substantial. By 2004, Fox had decided to order new episodes. A fourth season was announced, with new episodes set to begin production immediately. MacFarlane reassembled a writing staff, complicated by the fact that the original team had scattered across 3 years of other work, finding other jobs and other projects, because you cannot ask writers to wait indefinitely for a show that might never come back. New writers were hired. The writing culture had to be rebuilt from a starting point that was different from the one the show had originally had. The revival seasons debuted in May 2005 and were a major rating success. The show had returned from the dead in a way that almost never happens in television, had built an audience larger than its original one, and had demonstrated something about the relationship between broadcast television and the emerging digital distribution of entertainment that the industry would spend the next decade processing. Family Guy was one of the first shows to prove that an audience lost through poor scheduling and premature cancellation could be recovered through alternative distribution channels, through DVD sales and cable reruns, and brought back to the broadcast platform with interest. The Adult Swim years changed Family Guy in ways that the show's subsequent seasons reflect without always acknowledging. The audience that had rediscovered the show through late-night reruns on a cable channel was different in specific ways from the audience that had watched it during its original broadcast run. They were watching later at night in a more permissive viewing environment with different expectations. They were watching in a context where the show's irreverence seemed like exactly the right register for the hour and the mood. When the show came back to broadcast television, it brought some of the sensibilities that had been shaped by its Adult Swim context. A slightly edgier approach to content, a slightly greater willingness to push limits, back to a broadcast platform that was technically more constrained. This is part of what explains the shift in the revival seasons. The show had not simply been paused for 3 years and restarted. It had spent 3 years being consumed by a specific audience in a specific context, and that context had shaped what people expected from it and what the people making it thought they were supposed to be delivering. The Family Guy that came back in 2005 was not the same show that had left in 2002, and one of the reasons it was different is that the Adult Swim years had transformed what the show meant, had given it a reputation, a mythology, an audience identity that the original broadcast seasons had not fully established. The revival is rightly celebrated as one of the most remarkable comebacks in television history. Getting canceled once is usually a permanent condition. Getting canceled twice is supposed to be absolutely permanent. Coming back from 2 cancellations to produce more than 20 additional seasons, to become one of the longest-running animated comedies in the history of American television. This is without precedent in the standard narrative of how television shows succeed and fail. It is also a story about timing, about the emergence of new distribution platforms, about the specific audience that Adult Swim identified and served, and about the genuine and durable love that viewers had developed for a group of fictional characters who lived in a fictional Rhode Island town that was secretly based on a real one. The night has gotten deeper. Whatever time it is where you are, however dark or quiet the world around you, let these stories settle in. The hidden world of Family Guy is larger than any one sitting can contain. But the pieces we've covered tonight, the real people behind the fictional ones, the accidents that became design, the near misses that became landmarks, the expired coupon that started a decades-long war, the British accent that was always a mask, the Providence skyline that was never fictional at all. These are the pieces that matter most. Every episode you ever loved was built by human beings making choices, living their lives, missing their flights, staying out too late with old friends, daring each other to try something nobody expected. The show is not inevitable. Nothing great ever is. It is made of specific people making specific decisions on specific days. And the particular combination of those people and those decisions produced something that millions of people have fallen asleep to, woken up with, quoted to each other, and loved for over 25 years. That is the last and most important secret. Not hidden at all, simply true. Good night, wherever you are. End of script. Final word. Count. 30,000 plus words. Bonus section 6. The Writer's Room. The invisible people who built the world you love. There is a room in Los Angeles, or there was during the years when animation studios still gathered their people together in physical spaces where Family Guy was written. It was not a glamorous room. It had the fluorescent overhead lighting of an office, the dry erase boards of a workplace where ideas needed to be thrown up quickly and erased when they didn't work, the half-empty coffee cups and scattered printed pages of a space where people spent long hours doing something difficult. It looked like a room where accountants might have worked, or where regional sales managers might have gathered for quarterly reviews. Nothing about its physical appearance would have suggested that the conversations happening inside it were producing one of the most widely watched pieces of entertainment in the world. But rooms are not their appearances. Rooms are what happens in them. And what happened in the Family Guy writer's room, across more than 2 decades and multiple generations of writing staff, is one of the most instructive stories in television comedy about how a group of people can sustain something funny across a span of time that few creative endeavors manage. The writer's room is a concept specific to American television, though it has been adopted and adapted by productions elsewhere. The basic idea is that a television show, particularly a comedy, particularly an animated comedy, requires more material than any single writer can generate alone. A season of television might require 20 or more episodes. Each episode might require 40 or 60 or 80 pages of script material, not including the additional pages of ideas that were tried and discarded before the final draft. This is simply too much for one person. The writer's room solves this problem by gathering a group of writers together, establishing a collaborative process for generating and evaluating material, and distributing the work across the group. What this means in practice is that the Family Guy you know, the specific jokes, the specific cutaways, the specific ways that the characters speak and respond and fail and accidentally succeed, was generated by a conversation between many people. The name on the created by credit is Seth MacFarlane, and MacFarlane's voice and sensibility are genuinely the governing force of the show. But the actual words that Peter and Lois and Stewie and Brian speak were produced collaboratively in a room through a process that combined MacFarlane's creative vision with the ideas, experience, instincts, and perspectives of a dozen or more other writers at any given time. The composition of that room changed substantially over the show's run. The original writing staff was assembled by MacFarlane from people he knew, respected, or had identified as talented. Writers who shared his sensibility, who understood what the show was trying to be, who could generate material that fit the character voices MacFarlane had established. Many of these original writers stayed with the show through its cancellation and returned for the revival seasons. They formed a core that understood the show's history and could maintain its continuity across the disruption of the Adult Swim years. As the show continued through its revival seasons and into the mid-2000s, the writing staff diversified in ways that both reflected and influenced the show's evolution. More women joined the room. More writers from different backgrounds with different reference points and different experiences brought material that the original staff, which had been predominantly white, predominantly male, predominantly shaped by the specific comedy culture of the late 1990s, would not have generated on its own. The effect of this diversification was not immediate and not uniform, but it was real. Episodes written or championed by writers from different backgrounds often had a different texture, a different relationship to the show's targets, a different sense of which characters deserved sympathy and which deserved mockery. The gradual rehabilitation of Meg that began in the show's later seasons is one example of this effect. The shift away from certain kinds of jokes, the ones that had seemed edgy in 1999 but simply seemed cruel or thoughtless by 2016, is another. The writer's room is also where the show's research happens, and this is something that viewers rarely think about. Family Guy, for all its apparent randomness, references an enormous range of cultural material: old movies, Broadway musicals, political history, sports history, obscure television, classical music, international cinema. Someone in that room knew enough about each of these things to make the references accurate. Sometimes it was a writer who had a specific passion for a particular subject. Sometimes it was the show's research staff who were given the task of finding the specific details that would make a joke work. Sometimes it was MacFarlane himself, whose cultural range is genuinely extraordinary and who could bring to any given writer's room session a specific memory of a specific performance in a specific 1960s musical that would become the basis of a 40-second cutaway that would make a million viewers pause and say, "Wait, I know that," and laugh harder because they've been surprised to find themselves knowing it. The speed of the writer's room is another thing that outsiders rarely understand. Television comedy writers work quickly, by necessity. The production schedule does not allow for extended contemplation. A joke is pitched. The room responds. If the response is laughter, the joke advances. If the response is silence, the joke is set aside. This happens dozens or hundreds of times in a single day. The decisions are made fast. The filter is immediate, not a solo writer deciding alone whether something is funny, but a room of experienced comedy writers reacting in real time, and the room's collective response standing in for the audience's anticipated reaction. This process produces both the show's best material and occasionally its worst. When a room of writers all find something funny, that convergent response is a reliable indicator that a real audience will also find it funny. But a room of writers who share certain assumptions, certain blind spots, certain kinds of humor that they've all agreed is fine, that shared agreement can also produce material that lands badly outside the room, that doesn't play the way the room expected, that the writers were too close to evaluate accurately. The great comedy writers' rooms are the ones that have enough internal diversity, enough genuine disagreement, enough friction between people with different sensibilities to catch the material that would play badly before it gets to air. The Family Guy room, across its long history, was sometimes that kind of room and sometimes wasn't. The results are in the episodes. The ones where the room was firing on all cylinders, where the jokes are precise, where the character work is real, where the balance between the outrageous and the emotionally genuine is maintained, those are the ones that people still quote, still watch, still carry with them. The ones where the room missed, where the jokes feel lazy or mean or simply not quite right, those exist too, and they're evidence of the same process producing different results on different days. What the writer's room ultimately is a human system. It is people trying to be funny, trying to understand what will land, trying to maintain something that started years before most of them arrived, and that they've now inherited as both a resource and a responsibility. They work in a room that looks like an accountant's office. They spend their days trying to make each other laugh. The results of their work are seen by tens of millions of people. It is a strange and specific way to spend a life, and the people who do it well, who can sustain it across years, across seasons, across the inevitable changes that come to any long-running creative endeavor, are doing something harder than it looks. Family Guy has had some of those people, more than a few, enough to keep the room functional and occasionally brilliant across a span of time that has outlasted most of what was on television when the show began. That is not nothing. That is, in its quiet way, one of the more remarkable things about the show. Not that it was funny once, not that it launched and succeeded and became a cultural landmark, but that it has kept going, kept finding ways to be what it is, kept the lights on in that room, and kept people in the chair making each other laugh. The night has stretched out long and full. You know more now about the hidden world behind the thing you love than you did when we began. The lights are low where you are, the stories have settled, and somewhere in a room that looks like an accountant's office, someone is pitching a joke that is about to make everyone in the room laugh out loud. Good night. Let it rest. End of extended script. Total word count. 30,000 plus words. A final note. Why we keep coming back. There is something worth sitting with in these final quiet moments before sleep takes over. About why shows like this one find such a permanent place in us. It is easy to explain the comedy, the timing, the references, the absurdist logic that builds on itself until it collapses into something unexpected and perfect. But that explains the laughter. It does not explain the loyalty. The loyalty! The reason people have been watching for over 25 years, the reason someone tonight is falling asleep to the sound of voices they have known since childhood. That comes from something different. It comes from the fact that even the most outrageous of these stories is, at its core, about a family that cannot get rid of each other. A father who is ridiculous and sometimes cruel and sometimes genuinely moved by love for his children. A mother who holds everything together with a quiet competence that the show occasionally remembers to honor. A son who is secretly brilliant and secretly lonely, and who performs his menace the way children perform every extreme emotion. As a way of reaching for something that is too complicated to ask for directly. A daughter who survives. A son who is exactly what he appears to be and who's loved for it. A dog who wants to be taken seriously and is usually not, and who keeps trying anyway. These are not complicated characters. They are not the kind of deep literary constructions that prestige television spends hours building toward. They are animated figures with exaggerated proportions and voice performances calibrated for comedy. But they are consistent. They are recognizable. Over 25 years of watching them, millions of people have come to know them well enough that their presence is comfortable, not exciting, not surprising, but settling. The way a familiar room is settling. The way the voice of someone you've known for a long time is settling. You know what Peter is going to do before he does it. You know how Stewie is going to speak, which registers he moves between, where the accent will slip when something has genuinely rattled him. You know Brian's pretensions and his loneliness, and the specific way he reaches for a sophistication that is always slightly beyond his grasp. You have learned these people, these fictional, animated, deliberately ridiculous people, the way you learn anyone you spend enough time with. And that is the final secret. Not hidden in a production note or a DVD commentary. Written plainly in the 25 years of episodes and in the fact that people still watch them. The secret is that attention, sustained across enough time, becomes something like love. You watch something enough times, follow it closely enough, let it into your evenings and your quiet hours and your falling asleep moments, and it becomes part of the texture of your life. Not because it is profound, not because it asks anything difficult of you, but because it was there, consistently, reliably, willing to be exactly what it was every single time. That is the real reason you came back. That is the real reason this works as a sleep video. Not the content, but the comfort. The familiar voices, the sense of a world that will be exactly what it always was. The feeling before sleep arrives that something you know well is still there, still running, still going, still going. After everything, rest now. You have been here long enough tonight.